Hello, everyone. We have here a great panel of thinkers, Silas Zealberg, and Cazumbo, and also Psyche. And we're going to discuss my recent ebook, Man's Psyche, the Two Worlds, and of course, expand upon those topics that Silas very graciously and excellently, I would say, did an audiobook version as well. Welcome everyone. Welcome Zeal. Welcome Silas, Cazumbo, and Psyche.
Pleasure to be here.
All right. So Silas, you took some notes of topics that perhaps we could structure this conversation around. So what would be the first thing that from the book you would like to bring to the table for us to go around?
Well, I think the first thing we should discuss, and it's actually the first thing you discuss within your book, is the idea of the structure of the psyche. And really this underpins, firstly, how the psyche functions from both I guess you could call it a psychosocial level and also a deeper personal level, and how these control mechanisms influence the psyche and will effectively contort or veil the essence and the ego. So just to give a really brief overview of the structure of the psyche as described by you, Armunn, in the book. So firstly, we have the essence, and again, this is almost in a hierarchical format as you illustrate it in the book.
Yeah.
So firstly, the essence, the pure untouchable source of being, that which cannot be corrupted, the sort of spark or the impetus. Two, the ego, inner guide, not pride, but discernment. It cannot be destroyed, but it can be buried or veiled. Three, conscious, the true, deeper perceptual field, not the waking mind, but the memory-bearing inner witness. And then fourthly, the subconscious, the false surface world, sensory input, daily engagement, manipulated perceptions. And I liked as well how you switched around the traditional meanings of conscious and subconscious. And of course, there's an etymological basis for that. So that the conscious is in fact that which is higher than the subconscious, hence sub, meaning below.
Right.
And I think that was quite an apt thing to do. 5, the mind characters, personas adapted for interaction with others, necessary but easily hijacked. And I made a connection with the mind characters because, of course, there's multiple mind characters that we all have, right? For any given situation or, of course, any given worldview.
Right.
And each of them are brought to the front stage, as you mentioned. So you have a perception interaction, both with the exterior and the interior of man and his environment. And I found that interesting because it's almost similar to, in a way, the idea of the radial structure of the zodiac. So the mind characters, or the archetypes, if you will, are that of the zodiac, with the 13th or Ophiuchus sign being that of the radial center. I guess you could call that the ego or the individuated ego. And then sixthly, finally, you have the shadow. That is everything that is denied or disowned by the mind character, often projected onto others or institutions. And you mentioned this is a quote I took from the book. A quote, "The psyche's original architecture is sovereign. Only false worldviews distort it into servitude." And I found that quite an apt quote. And there was something I was pondering regarding that. It's, could you go into, and of course this is open to everyone, but could you go into, what are the specific, we're going to get into this more so as the discussion develops, but what systems or narratives would you say distort our psyche into servitude, into this shadow mindset, or into these false worldviews?
Yeah. Well, in a way, to begin answering that question, I will backtrack a little bit and explain why I chose to use the same words like conscious and subconscious and even ego that are already in use by traditional psychology and even spiritual paths, um, to that I think that I view that were misappropriated, in a sense that they were copied and somehow inverted or subverted to represent different things. So the reason why I kept those words, because I could have come up with different terms, instead of ego a different word, instead of conscious, etc. But I really wanted to emphasize that language, the wordplay, let's say, is a major method of doing that subversion, right? Because if, for example, if you and all over our lives we've heard, for example, the word egotistic, or that, oh, you have a lot of ego, you have an inflated ego, right? You have this ego problem, or whatever it is, right? And the ego is usually treated as an inner enemy, something that you need to control, or to sort of put under that strength of the will, or so on. And what actually is being said there, if we look at the actual programming of the words, is that ego means I, or me. So what you're being programmed with is the idea that you have to control the individuality in favor of a collective, right? Because it's when you associate, for example, egotistic with someone who has a lot of ego, who has a lot of individuality, you are actually subverting what egotistic means. Because an egotistical person is not following his individual self interest. What he's actually following is his position in the social structure, right? It is not about the individual self interest, which would perhaps even be the best self interest he would have is to cooperate with others in a balanced manner, for example, right? But what you see in egotistical behavior is mind characters that try to improve their stance, or their status, or their position in the social structure. It's always in relation to the collective, right? So it's not actually an entirely individual thing. In the same way, like you mentioned, that the conscious and the subconscious, in my opinion, had to be inverted, but keeping the same words. Because if you treat subconscious, so below, as more important, like psychology does, as more important in the psyche than the conscious, then what you're actually saying is that something that is below has more effect. And note how this is important, because usually in the West, and I say usually because it's not entirely 100%, but usually in the West, we have this Christian background that teaches about heaven and hell, and heaven is above, hell is below, right? So if you treat the subconscious as having more authority, you're saying that hell, in a subverted way, hell has more authority than heaven, right? In influencing the psyche, right? So these are, this type of wordplay is used extensively, in my opinion, to subvert exactly that sovereignty, the individual sovereignty of the psyche. Now, with that said, the first thing that emerges, in my opinion, for a creation of a worldview is a tension regarding some future thing that doesn't exist and that you want to avoid because of some either a good thing that you want to maintain, or an uncomfortable thing that you want to keep away, right? And so this is the starting point that usually creates, let's say, a schism between the organic individuality and a projection of a partial thing that is no longer you, but that you decide to become in order to avoid this thing or to have more of that, right? And so that beginning premise, initially, even in the individual, already begins a new worldview, you know. And you can see, for example, an extreme case of that in mental patients that have a complete delusion, like that they perceive reality in a completely different way, because they are either hiding from something bad, or longing or wanting to maintain an illusion that they always have something good, right? So this is an extreme case, but all worldviews are sold under that premise, in my opinion, and they use that tension that may emerge, and it usually emerges from a lack of faith in the own individuality, right? um, and it is then exploited to create a system where predictability is increased, because if predictability is increased, you don't need to worry as much about what happens tomorrow, right? I mean, if you live in an agricultural setting, and I'm just using that as an example because it was also an example used in the book. If you live in an agricultural setting, you know what you're going to do tomorrow, right? It's, that this field work needs to be done, or check the livestock, or whatever it is. So you have a routine, and routine is funny because it's a word also used for computer programs, right? You have a routine that sets up the psyche to become a program. So the mind character that you were talking just previously is, entirely comparable to an AI program, right? And it is programmable by external prompts. It should be entirely programmable, let's say, by internal prompts. So the ego would be the one saying, okay, perform this task, right? And the task is then applied and done by the mind character on an individual basis, perhaps in cooperation, of course, with the rest of the familial group, or whatever context, social context that that individual is inserted in. But what actually happens there is an inversion, where the decision center for the, let's say, prompting of the mind character is externalized. It becomes, it could be the priest, it could be the village chief, it could be, whatever figure of authority that is externalized, becomes the one that regulates the routine of that mind character, right? And then it can be internalized to such an extent that it becomes autonomous. So the program runs by itself without the need for a prompt, right? And that's where you get, for example, the voice in your head, which Freud called the superego, right? Which is sort of like the voice of society in your head. What will the policeman think? What will the judge think? What will my mother think, right, of me? What will my partner think of me, etc. And you can regulate the programming by self-prompting, in the same way that you can
Exactly.
ask an AI to prompt itself, right, under certain directives. So these are, a bit scratching on the surface, but these are in general key components of the subversion.
Yeah, I think you've brought, superb points. That idea of you just brought up is one of your last points with the, the self surveillance basically via the collective standards of the society. There was something I was listening to very recently. It might have actually been that Predictive History channel, and it was actually with his video "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," and he speaks on how according to official history, of course, but just take this as anecdote, that the first several empires, the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires, that they used force and fear directly, fear
Mhm.
induced by force. So it was that idea that, they are the hammer and every problem essentially becomes the nail. But then you had the likes of Cyrus the Great in the Achaemenid Empire. And when that eventually ousted in the 6th century BC, that of the Neo Babylonian Empire, Cyrus the Great instituted Zoroastrianism. And effectively, what Zoroastrianism did is, firstly, it had monotheism at its heart. So, monotheism allows for this centralization of all religion and deities unto this one supreme deity. And moreover, as well, this monotheism and this supreme deity usually comes with laws, commandments, and one of the highest commandment was that that of being honest. And what you find with the Achaemenid Empire is because of that institution of religion, which itself was a type of control mechanism that induced that mind character of the Zoroastrian in the individual, again leading to self-surveillance to bring about the predictability of honesty within the bureaucrat all the way down to, of course, the farmer, right? So it permitted a society that was working on a collective basis with almost a collective psyche, or not even psyche, but a collective worldview, a collective mind character. And
Yeah.
so it's extremely powerful, and you see the same thing with Abrahamism. I mean, look at their eschatologies. They're effectively self-fulfilling prophecies. All of the world is being geared towards this I guess you could call it a form of apocalyptic catastrophism. Either Jesus is going to return or the Mashiach is going to come or whatever it may be. They believe it's prophecy, but in fact, all it is a sort of collectivized mind character at play here. Does a way to frame this? There was a quote that you mentioned. Oh, yes, I wanted to bring up, and Kazumbo or Zealberg can jump in here. This idea of self-improvement. You were mentioning about improvement of the mind character, through the collective standards. But it makes me wonder, this fad of self-improvement, I wonder if this is connected to that as well, right? Because self-improvement effectively is, I mean, of course, there's many facets of it. Ultimately, it stems from the New Age. But it appears to be almost expressing institutional values, right? It seeks to create of people this sort of atomized institutional automaton, right? Without action, through the guise, of course, of self-improvement. I don't know if anyone else has any comments to make upon that. Zeal, Kazumbo, Armunn?
Anyone?
Just a
Hmm.
quick kind of
Yeah.
thought on it. Like the self-improvement thing is sort of perhaps tied in with the kind of Homo Deus kind of cultural, like this concept of the human is not good enough as is and must be modified or improved, or it must have its improprieties kind of, it must be normalized, so this it's perhaps tied in with that. Look, and it's in the middle of advertising as well, because you're worth it. It's just kind of you're just constantly selling value, that you are valueless, but you must move toward a sense of value. So you're self-improving all the time because you're worth it. And there's a kind of some sense in there that the human being as is kind of is flawed and imperfect and useless. The useless classes. So it's all of these types of narrative I think are all kind of connected in that sense.
Absolutely, Zeal. And I would say even further that I mean you've hit the nail on the head, because all of those ideas that Silas was naming as New Age actually emerge from Theosophy. And even before Theosophy was instituted formally, which was, if I'm not mistaken, 1875, if I'm not mistaken, those ideas were already being inserted into society. And the major example of that actually prepared the ground for all that you've mentioned, and for all that Theosophy eventually implemented in the following century, was the Darwin's theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest, and so on, and the idea that Okay, because before that you had this theist idea that God created the world, right? And so it, by inference, also created man, and it created with a certain structure and so on. And what Darwin did was cut. So it was, in a sense, quote unquote, kill God from the psyche in that sense. And Cazumbo would disagree, but I would say that it's not that God was legitimate by itself in the psyche, but it basically removed that component and said that what we are is a product of a work, a self improvement, like is being said now, right? So, and that self improvement ends up, in the theosophical sense, in ascended. You become an ascended master. So it's beyond human. You transcend humanity and become something like the Homo Deus that you were talking about. And it's interesting because I think Darwinism links perfectly with theosophy, because remember that theosophy has the theories of the root races, right? And so these root races were races that evolved up to a certain threshold, and from that moment on, they passed the baton to the next race, the next race that would evolve the next stage or something like that. So one root race evolved, for example, emotions. I think those were the Lemurians. The Atlanteans evolved the intellect, and so on and so forth. I mean, they equate each of the root races with a particular trait. And of course, this always puts the individual in a position of, first of all, I'm, too small, I am unimportant, right? Which is also linked as well with not geocentrism, sorry, heliocentrism, and the nasotology that is now the main thing. But it makes the individual feel insignificant, and it puts a standard that the individual can never achieve, right? Which also links with Buddhism, and in a way, it links also with Christianity, of course. That they also use that, but it's now used to an extent of It's like they told people you are free from the chains of God, right? But you still have work to do. Right? You still have um, to let go of your sins and to let go of all the imperfections and so on, when those imperfections are actually attacking individual traits in favor of collective ones. And just to finish this point, I'm sorry about the lengthy comment, but in Japan, I've found out recently, due to Sayo, that there was a character named, was it Kanjiro? Kinjiro, sorry. A character named Kinjiro that introduced to a Japan that wasn't unified. So this idea of unified Japan is fairly recent. It came from the Meiji Restoration, around the time that Theosophy was created. Actually, it was 1880 something that the Meiji Restoration started. And this character introduced a completely new theosophical base philosophy that actually made the collective Japanese stance that we know now, right? Which is this entirely hive mind, collective focused. What is important is how you contribute to the collective, and you should not ever shame your family or your collective or your by doing an individual thing, right? So that all plays in a worldwide scale, in every locality that we can think of. It played nicely into this picture of the introduction of a new worldview.
Just really quickly as well to mention, it's something that's always struck me as rather peculiar. I've never quite understood why they did this, but interestingly as well, we find within Japan and its links with Theosophy that you had several theosophical societies, and I guess sub-societies or branch schools of thought that emerged primarily after World War II. But you had the Order of the Star in the East. That was the global organization founded by the Society's leadership in the early 20th century. And then you had as well the Green Dragon Order, which was a mystical Tibetan or Japanese occult order. And then you also had as well, there was another society, and I can't quite find its name. Oh, here we go. Yeah, after World War II, the Ryukyei, or the Dragon King Society, was established and introduced theosophical teachings, including those from Alice Bailey, later registering the Nippon Lodge with the international headquarters of Adyar in 1971. So you had all of these very interesting. I mean, you could actually say they're strategically placed, these mystical
Absolutely.
societies.
Mhm.
And it appears that they're placed in civilizations that are being targeted for a sort of, I guess you would call it a social transmutation, right? An alchemical social transmutation. And see, that this touches upon the theory that I have regarding how religions develop. And I think religions develop actually from the esoteric roots. And I think that's something that's used firstly by a sort of a colluding class of I guess you could call them opportunists, seasoned intellectuals, philosophers, probably astronomers, whatever they may be. They get together, they formulate this psychologically compatible, and you go into this, Armunn, in your book, why it's psychologically compatible. And I think what you say in regards to that is completely true. This psychologically compatible, almost artificial ego, right?
Yes.
So it creates all of these sort of symbolic tropes, these symbolic touchstones within the mythology, this esoteric mythology to begin with, that they use to inculcate and to basically brainwash, let's call it what it is, to brainwash the nobility, the intelligentsia, perhaps there's a previous priest class there, the financier class, the industrialists, anyone who's at the sort of zenith or the apex of the social hierarchy. They first control them through initiation vis-a-vis this sort of compartmentalized, esoteric, secret society structure. Then, once they have control of the top tiers of that society, then the top tiers of that society produce a religion, a revealed religion, an exoteric religion, which is then, of course, used, it's propagated, proliferated, used to infect the minds of the populace. And of course, what you say in the book, Armunn, regarding how it interacts with the psyche itself, I think you're pretty much on point. Um, and of course, you mention it as well. It's constantly reinforced because it's a lie, right?
Yes.
Lies require that constant reinforcement because they're a diversion, a deviation from the natural mean, if you will. So essentially, what they're attempting to do is to stop mean reversion. So they do this through the event hoaxing and history writing. So essentially, they're through language, through symbolism, through everything. They're carefully crafting a stage. They're placing the scenery, placing the props. They're writing the play to immerse the audience, which are in fact paradoxically the actors as well. It's again a sort of self-referential loop. Um, they immerse the characters and the audience in the play through these means. And
Yeah.
like what you said, you don't need that. If you have a natural, of course you can have natural communities, right, that aren't collectives.
Of
The
course.
two are
Yeah.
totally
Mhm.
different, and you can have stories and things like that. But those things don't need to be constantly reinforced, and those things as well are they're devoid of any false, well, shadows. Really, they're devoid of this sort of you know, you bring it up in the book. For example, if you were to claim to a normie, right? Let's just use that term for lack of a better one. That I don't know, COVID was a hoax, right? It was simply developed to expand the control of the state and, like what you stated, ultimately to create a more predictable society. If you were to say that to them and you were to state to them that in fact virology is all false, all of this is just complete fabrication, it's a religion in and of itself, it's something to bind the mind to the institutions and what they espouse, of course they would feel personally threatened by that because they've
Naturally. Naturally.
completely embodied that mind character, that false worldview, that shadow, and they've rejected their natural self. And could you go into narcissism as well? I thought that was very interesting. So you mentioned that the narcissist effectively has taken on the mind character completely to the point where they've, I mean, buried 6 feet under their ego. And
Yes.
why do you think I don't know if you would agree with me. If you don't, then of course we can skip this question. But I think you would, that narcissism has become almost the central pillar of our society, our modern society. Why would you say that's the case? Why have they attempted to inculcate that through social media and such? Of course, the mind character itself defends the institution, but are there other reasons for this narcissism becoming so proliferated in the modern society?
Yeah, well, first I'll just backtrack a little bit as well, just to say that the micro is equivalent to the demon in the previous worldview, right? So in the previous worldview, you had, okay, you get sick because you have an evil spirit, or a demon influenced you, or whatever, right? Now you get sick because a small microscopic demon infiltrated you, right? And you weren't strong enough to resist the temptation. Your immune system wasn't strong enough to resist the influence of that demon, and you got sick. This is also important to define, in my opinion, because it plays a central role. You always need to have this idea of an enemy, and to me, it's completely insane to think that it's like those autoimmune diseases that are now being talked about. I think it's crazy because no organism attacks itself. That is completely the reversal of what is nature. No organism attacks itself. It may attack another for food or for protection or for whatever, but it never attacks itself. So autoimmune also is one of those things. Regarding the narcissism question, well, you were talking about and you were using that metaphor of the stage is set and the characters are actually the audience itself as well, right? And the issue there, so I don't think that there are that many full-blown narcissists. When I say full-blown, is like 100%. But the society has been acquiring a lot of narcissistic traits, which is not as extreme as a full-blown narcissist. And those narcissistic traits stem from the fact that since they are performing a script for which they are the audience itself, they not only create a loop of judgment, of criticism, in the sense of, like, you're watching a movie and you can say, oh, this actor is really lousy, right? But now imagine that the actor is you, right? The actor that you see on the screen, right? So now you are looking at that as your identity, right? So I have to improve my acting within this particular script, within this particular movie, right? And so this deviates further and further from the actual organic, unscripted self, which is the ego. So it acquires, when I was saying, for example, earlier, that actually an egotistic person is not doing things solely based on their self-interest, is because they are always acting in relation to the collective. In this case, in relation to the script, to the movie, to whatever you want to call it. So they become disconnected from that organic individuality, and the only source of both criticism and validation is the external, which is also them, right? Because, like you said, they are the ones playing the role, but they are also the audience. So they are observing themselves from the collective point of view. It's as if a narcissist can only see himself from the outside, if you can imagine this,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's like things like virtue signaling, right? Virtue signaling is only happens because you see yourself from the outside, right? You see yourself in the eyes of the neighbors, the community, or the whoever is watching, right? If you see yourself from within, probably you would have a different, behavior, or you wouldn't go down that road, right? So what you're trying to do is to be the best actor you can be in that scripted movie, right? So you're given a role and you're going to be the best, you're going to perform that role the best you can, always, always seen from the audience and director point of view, right? From the outside. So that is, I think, because to me, of course, it needs to be clarified just, for that clarification, that a narcissist is, of course, someone who is devoid, a full-blown narcissist is someone who is completely devoid of the connection to its own ego, and therefore it has nowhere internally to fall back to. Like when you have a timeout, you go to your room, whatever, you're alone, you fall back to your ego, you fall back to this sense of individual self. A narcissist does not have that because that connection was severed, usually from an early age, often by trauma, but not necessarily, a big trauma like usually is depicted. It can be a small, gradual sequence of traumas, little rejections that made him disconnect from the individuality. But in actual fact, what happens is that the narcissist does not have that sense of individual self. So when he's alone, he has to see himself from the outside. And so he is much better with other people. In fact, he relies upon having someone that enables a validation or at least an observation. He needs an audience, right? Remember that part in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that the actors need an audience, otherwise they don't
Yes.
exist. Remember? So that is
Mhm.
the definition of a narcissist. Without the audience, they don't exist in the internal sense. You understand?
Well, I think this perfectly outlines social media as a
Of
tool
course.
for
Yeah.
conditioning and reconditioning. So everything is based around social validation, and it's almost in a way. This is why democracy, of course, is something that's constantly used by um, tyrants. Well, of course, not the political system, but just the idea of that system. The system itself isn't as it's of course touted as. Even that's the case even historically since its founding. Democracies are always used by tyrannies or oligarchies or however we want to define the authoritarian regime that is the underlying power of a democracy. And it's because democracy itself is based around, of course, I mean, you could say simplistically a popularity contest, but it's not really anything to do with the ballots. It's the entire society of a democratic nature really takes on that social validation mechanism that everything has to go through the demos, right? I believe as well you brought up the idea of the mob and the mob mentality in the book too, if I recall. And I think this ties in with that as well. That there's almost there's a dissociation that occurs, a depersonalization that occurs a detachment, like what you were saying, that occurs within the narcissist. And I think that's something you see constantly, conditioned, reconditioned, programmed into individuals from the earliest formative years, all the way to, well, the indoctrination centers of compulsory education. This thing is inculcated in them that their views have to align with the collective. And I do recall we would have like arguments and debates, and even when I took the philosophy class, well, it was religious, moral, and philosophical education or studies. When I took that class, we did a lot of debates and argumentation. But I recall that at the end of the debate, we would have to compromise on both sides, and we would all have to agree on a single. That's how you would conclude it. You would agree on a single issue, right? This compromising of the two sides, even though if one side was a lie, clearly, demonstrably, and
Yeah.
one side was not. Again, all the entire exercise of the debate was not to find truth. It was to maintain and to even reinforce the collective's
Right.
identity and stability. Do you have any comments, Cazumbo or Zealberg, on these topics? The idea of narcissism, the mechanism of social validation as, I guess, collective identity reinforcement and things such as that.
Well,
I, sorry, go ahead.
oh, thank you. I would just say, also connecting to a topic really early on, I would say that there is an individual and intrinsic urge to contribute that our society is having placed their values, their hierarchy of values upon us, appeal not just as slaves or as slavery, but to our best interest, because not only do we want to contribute, but society places the framework which directly influences our proficiency, which is that which we are most inclined to do. That being said, as we go on about life, we encounter these instances where we found ourselves naturally unable to contribute, however, feel the pressure to do so, because that is from where that validation, that feeling of being active and useful comes from. Therefore, that creates what you guys were exploring before as man as being intrinsically contributing without stop as a slave of the system, essentially. Regarding democracy, I would say that the decentralization of power is even more dangerous than centralization of it. One, because it creates an abstract enemy that you cannot destroy because it is made of several heads. And two, because the system becomes so structured, no matter how much one individual or one section deviates, there is always an automatic correction to itself that will ensure its continuation. Therefore, reforms become just another form, ironically, of perpetuating that system throughout time. And revolution in itself comes as a destruction with the objective of reconstruction, that as well implements another idea into reality, whether it is better, progressive, or more humane. That is up to debate.
Build back better, right? And also, democracy has another effect, which is it's the people themselves that are become active agents through the worldview they share of that construction. So if someone is, some foreign invader militarily takes over your land and subjugates you and so on, you have that enemy that you can see. You look at him, you know who it is. It's only a matter of gaining enough power to fight back, right? But in democracy, what happens is that you become the invader, right? You actually actively participate and therefore have investment in the system itself. So 100% Kazumbo. Zealberg, you were going to say?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw out just an anti-point, just for the sake of maybe stimulating a little bit of debate on it. But like, I hear this term narcissist, and it's become like a kind of an accepted. Like, I'm just throwing out an anti kind of point here, kind of like, just to debate it. Like, is the point itself, the word itself, the term itself, like an accepted pop psychology term that we've just sort of swallowed and have digested without actually kind of thinking about it as to its validity and how real it is as such. I know in some of I see the notes on your book there, Armunn, you're talking about this kind of concept of a kind of a fabricated reality, like a shared, fake syndrome. That's a shared hypothesis of what is around us, but it's actually unreal or fake. So I'm going to just throw it out there that perhaps narcissism itself is one of these terms, one of these ideas that's just not real. And
Well,
just to finally, sorry to cut it, the narcissism is actually it's what we're seeing is a kind of an inversion. It's a kind of a self-hatred or a self-destruction, and it's been branded as narcissism. But actually, what's happening is a kind of a destruction of selfhood, and
Yes, absolutely. And listen, usually you would see narcissism associated with an inflated ego, which was the first point that I made. Which is like you paint like a narcissist is someone who is so individual that he cares about nothing else but himself, right? And that is not the case. It is exactly an inversion, because these are the people that are the least individual. Because if they were individual, they would be able to see that their actions are not at all in their self-interest. They are actually in the interest of a character that they are playing in a collective fake play, right? In this sort of theater that people do with each other in society, right? Like some often pretending to be one thing when they are another, and et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely correct that it became a term that's why I say that there aren't as many full-blown narcissists as people think, because every time you post anything on talking about narcissism, there's always comments saying, oh yes, yeah, my boyfriend, my girlfriend was a narcissist, was a narcissist, my neighbor was a narcissist, everyone was a narcissist. No, they were revealing narcissist traits due to this that you just mentioned, due to the inculcation of a fake worldview that promotes the disconnection with actual individuality. It doesn't mean that they are actually full-blown narcissists. That is a condition that, in my opinion, it's not as frequent at all as is depicted. So, absolutely agreed. There's it.
And as well, I think there's a kind of an inversion in the term. There's a kind of a secretive kind of a worship for this. Like what you use, what one might use as a term, a disparaging term, he or she is a narcissist. There's actually a kind of a latent kind of a jealousy in using the term to describe someone. It's as if, secretly deep down, you wish you were as sort of had, I don't know, flashy or glamorous as what one might perceive to be the narcissist. So I think there's a kind of a subtext in the use of the word, in the common use of that word in the narrative. And I think there's a vortex around this kind of self-hate, or implosion of the self, that other people view the narcissist in inverted commas, and they themselves are somehow intrigued by the narcissist, or they're like a moth around a flame. Like they use it as a disparaging term, but at the same time they pour attention toward the narcissist, even if it's to to detangle them, or to point them out, or to try to laugh at them, or scorn them, or deride them for their behavior. But it's at the same time pouring attention toward this. So the whole thing is very a kind of an inverted kind of a thing going on. And I think there's some sort of a vortex, like a kind of a whirlpool around this concept of this manifestation of people who are sort of plastic and kind of, but people are drawn to this, like, they're drawn to this. It's like, as you say, as in the notes of your book, it's this fake world, this fake reality. It's they're sort of drawn to it. Like Taylor Swift for me is kind of an epitome of this type of character. Even though it's nothing against the lady personally, I don't know her. I'm talking about the construct, the media sort of mass music construct that's hoisted onto the the popular stage for mass consumption, and its audience is created to consume the product as well. And you're kind of you're standing in the wings going, is this real? Is any of this real? This cannot be real. Yet it is a type of a kind of a synthetic reality, of a fabricated reality. And that's the central point in your book, I think, Armunn. One of them, anyway.
Listen, since 2000, when was it? 2000, I think, that George W. Bush was elected president. Was it 2000? Not sure.
2000, yeah.
2000, okay. Since George W. Bush, I mean, you had this image of, even here in Portugal, of the president of the USA as the most powerful man on earth, right? Like this was the figure that, whatever he says is, counts. It's something that we have to pay attention to, right? And since George W. Bush, I mean, who acted, I'm not saying that he was playing a part, but who acted as a buffoon, right?
Yeah.
Note the sequence all the way, and now you have Trump.
Yeah.
Okay, Trump is a cartoon character, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
Trump is like, I mean, he comes out of a comic book, right? And how many people would say, for example, oh, Trump is a narcissist, but in the same thought say, I would love to be in his shoes, right? And this is the problem right here. And of course, you talk about Taylor Swift. It's the same with superstars, be it in music, be it in cinema, be it in whatever field it is, or football, or whatever. It's the same, because you can accuse, oh, this guy is, for example, here in Portugal, we have actually, apparently, he met Trump recently. We have a superstar footballer called Cristiano Ronaldo, which I'm sure you're familiar, at least you've heard of him. And he acts as this, superstar guy. I'm the best. I'm the best. I'm the best. And people might, in the same thought, say, "Oh, he's narcissistic," or he's, he doesn't show any modesty, or whatever. But in the same thought, they would say, "I would love to be him," right? So, absolutely, what you're saying, that envy that is inculcated into it, of course, plays a big part. Certainly, absolutely. And the more ridiculous thing become, because, like I told you, there was a semblance of normality, or not normality, a semblance of formality up until 2000, in the geopolitics of the world. And after that point, it became like a cartoon. Gradually, it wasn't all at once, but gradually it turned into a cartoon. We have already lived through moments that when we were, like in the 90s or whatever, we would never imagine seeing happen. 2020 was one such moment, but even a president such as George W. Bush or Trump was unimaginable, because we always had this idea of that formality, right? Of this image of the politician and the image of how society works, how society responds, and so on and so forth. That has all been already taken down by this mentality that uses this implied fake narcissism. That's why I say it's narcissistic traits and not full-blown narcissism, because it's like a play. It's like people mimetically copy behaviors that they don't even know they're copying, right? Through the social media and etc. And look at how it affected society in just 20 years, right? 25 years, right? So it's really visible, that you were saying, Zeal. Absolutely.
No, but it's a very interesting point, because especially with regard to, and sorry to divert a little bit, but especially with regard to the figureheads, the social, like political figureheads. And like I remember thinking, like if you looked at the trajectory in Russia, so from say Joseph Stalin up to the current president, what's his name, Putin, and like at a certain time in Russian history, you had, basically the collapse of communism. But the stages of the collapse were sort of mirrored by the state figureheads. So in the collapse, you kind of had like Boris Yeltsin, the buffoon, drunken, the drunken bear, dancing drunk, a total joke, like a clown. He was an alcoholic jumping around on the camera and making a fool of himself, and he mirrored the state at that point, starting to collapse. And then the old communist system, rather, and then you had the sort of perestroika, glasnost. You had a kind of a stabilization where the father figure, Gorbachev, was rolled out, and Gorbachev was fatherly, he was wise, he was astute, he was kind, approachable. So he began to normalize. And then you had the new manifestation, which was corporate, sort of corporate, Kabbalistic kind of, the in crowd, the billionaires, which was Putin. So each one of these characters, to use one of your terms, like were mental characters, were manifestations of the social view of what the state was, or the power structure at what at any given point. But as you rightly point out, and with regard to the current American president, he's a manifestation sort of his age, and he's timely in the sense that the American people would not have been able for, no one would have been able for a president like that at a previous time, because they wouldn't have been prepped for that kind of character formation. That's a total, how would you say it? Like, as you say, he's eschewed all the aspects of conformity, and he's completely broken down. He's presenting the the house, the elected house, as just a kind of a, how would you say it, a mess, a kind of just a personality kind of cult. That's just a total.
Would you ever imagine that you heard from the mouth of a president of the United States of America something saying that it would be better to stop elections altogether and to have a dynasty of kings again?
Yeah. Well, his words are bullets into the body of the Statue of Liberty. The words out of his mouth are bullets into the American dream.
But this is,
they're bullets into the American psyche. He's destructive. He's designed to destroy. He is the sheep, the what do you call the letter in Hebrew? The shev,
Shin.
the
Yeah.
sin,
Exactly.
rather. I beg your pardon.
Bingo.
He's the destroyer. He's destroying the old world, and I think it's back to this original point, this manifestation of narcissism and homo deus, and like he's an extreme manifestation of this is what I want. I'll say what I want. I have no God. I have no law. I have nothing in front of me that will stop me from what So he very much is that like manifestation of that kind of zeitgeist that you're talking about.
Yeah, and it is admired. Yeah,
So, yeah, of course. And we all secretly do admire it. Like I secretly, this is the power of the propaganda. Like you're watching the telly and the guy says something bombastic, and deep down you can feel if your self discernment is kind of button is switched on, you can a bit of yourself going, I wish I could say that. I wish I could go into tomorrow
Yeah.
and tell the manager that, and tell everyone that, and just be completely that powerful. And I can if I play a game with the corporation. And if I let the corporate kind of ethos into my mind and into my soul, and I should embrace it. So this is what we're kind of been told: embrace it. I think
Yes.
that's part of the Trump phenomenon. We should embrace this kind of this energy.
Yeah, you were
Even
going
the-
to say, Silas?
yeah,
It's also interesting as well because this is basically a formula that we're seeing replay itself within America, and it occurred with Rome. And funnily enough, it was something I was toying with the first book, and I actually at the time I thought it was completely insane for me to mention this, but it was a thought that came into my mind, and I was like, yeah, I'll mention it. So one of the sections touches upon the populist Caesars, and what I stated was that there's a potential that either Trump will be a proto-Caesar figure or will be a Caesar figure. And just generally, you tend to these things are formulaic. Even Spengler mentioned that come the final stage, the sort of withering of the flower of the civilization during the onset of its winter of discomfort and deathly renewal, you would have the Caesar figure, and what people would see as almost a revitalization is in fact the death knell of the civilization. It's similar to the throes of death, right? Before you,
Right.
of course, return into the void. Not mean to be morbid. People talk about this sort of euphoric feeling, right?
The
That they
swan
feel
song.
like they're
Yeah.
exactly the swan song. That's exactly what the Caesar figure is, and this is something we've seen with Rome as well. There is a ritualistic reason for that. It goes back to that self-fulfilling prophecy of the eschatology. But for example, you brought up Gorbachev, right? Now we have Trump, Donald Trump, of course. Don or Donald or Donal is from the Irish god, the Gaelic god Don, who is the god of war and death. And he was also I believe he was the keeper of the thresholds too, between life and death. Similar to almost like a Valkyrie or some sort of Hadean figure. And then you have as well Trump, right? So this relates to, of course, the Trump card. He is the chaos magician. And interestingly, with Gorbachev, you
And
had
the
this
trumpet of Revelation. The
the
trumpets of
Trump
Revelation.
exactly, and judgment as well. So it's the same idea. You're in the penultimate twilight. But Gorbachev was a similar characteronym, and this is what these things are called, characteronyms. And you see them throughout narrative productions, and it's essentially the author. Um, it's probably something to do with the way that human beings need causal determinism and the way that they categorize ideas, even subconsciously when they're writing fiction or they're writing plays or stage performances. They will categorize these individuals and they'll choose a name that even perhaps subconsciously, not unknown to themselves in their conscious mind, evokes a certain character's description or role within the story. So this is what we see with Trump. It's what we saw with Gorbachev. Gorbachev itself, from Russian, comes from Gorbach, which is hunchback, runaway, or vagabond. And these ideas almost have, it's similar to Trump, right? You're basically the reversal. That's what it would, it's the sort of meaning it would invoke within Russian. And so it's basically the hunchback, the deformation of the system itself, the unanchoring of the Soviet system, the unraveling of it, you know, because the Soviet system is similar to, it was similar to any system. Of course, by its end, it was a managerialist, despotic system that essentially was living on the fumes of people's, you know, sort of, again, collective imagination, their false worldview, right? Gorbachev basically came in as a wrecking ball and essentially undone all of that through various staged events, which was designed, they were designed to basically unanchor, destroy like a wrecking ball, the idea of the Soviet Union, to destroy, because remember, all civilizations themselves are they are built on a false worldview. They're built on a noble lie, a pious fiction. And like what you said, Armunn, in your book, all of it has to, all of the mind characters that are formulated within the population, all of these false artificial egos and archetypes and whatever term we want to use, they have to basically pay homage to the noble lie, or they have to be built from it, right? So again, it creates that self-referential loop. If you destroy that, you destroy everything. So it's like what you're saying, Zeal. If he was to actually, you know, become a Caesar figure, a dictator for life, and he's hinted at it as the character he's playing. He mentioned in the election, if you vote for me, if you vote for me this time, this election, you won't have to vote again, right? So you can think of that in many different ways, but he's opening up the potential for this sort of dynastic Caesarism to take hold, which itself would that would end the American experiment. America, as you know, it would end. If you America only functions. Of course, it's not a federated system, not now. It's a unitary government, but there's the belief in the population that it's a federated republic. America and Americanism is basically built around that idea. If you were to upend that in any way by something equivalent to, say, Gorbachev, essentially destroying the Soviet Union and ending it, you effectively destroy that idea. You bury it, right? So America, as you know it, would just fracture. It would break apart, or it would enter another phase. You know, another
let
idea.
Let me just introduce another thing to add to what you're saying. I would say, for example, that the USSR, when it quote unquote collapsed, became the USA, and when the USA quote unquote collapses, becomes the world. Right. So it's basically more than, you know, that destruction of the locality based worldview actually expands it. It moves it overseas, moves it to other places. You understand what I'm trying to say? You remove. It's like, okay, you have this thing contained within these four walls, right? And of course, the wall played a big part in the collapse of the Soviet Union, as you know, and it also it played a part in Trump being elected, if you remember the wall with Mexico. But so the symbol of the wall, when the wall collapses, it releases this worldview to spread, right? It's no longer contained behind what would be the Iron Curtain or the, you know, the American democracy or American dream, and it spreads, and it becomes the worldview of the entire world, let's say, right? And it's interesting because it's one of the things that I like to point out whenever I come across, which is rare nowadays, but whenever I come across a nationalist or someone who holds, the nationalist view, we have this country and etc., is that, the country did the same exact thing that globalists do, but in a localized, smaller scale, right? Because for a country to be formed, you have to unite these people that are probably would never organically come together, which doesn't mean that they would be adversarial. It means that, they probably would never organically just unite under a single rule or whatever. And you bring them into a unification that is entirely fake, right? And that unification is the same that the globalization is doing, right? Only in a smaller scale, right? And you have the example of the British, the Great Britain, United Kingdom thing, which you unite Britons, Angles, Saxons, Normans, Welsh, Scots, Irish, etc., into now I'm British, or I'm whatever you guys call yourselves, right? So it's, which is the same with Spain, because this is not particular. This is all over. It's the same with Spain. So in Spain, you had countless kingdoms, crowns, that had differentiated people with differentiated language, and you unify them under one language, one religion, etc. Now you're Spanish. So it's basically the same thing, right? What is the difference between the process that emerges, that makes a nation emerge, and the process of globalization? No difference. It's just the scale of it is much larger, in my opinion.
If you want to jump in, Zeal.
Yeah. Like I was thinking kind of briefly about a similar topic today, because I've been listening to PJ Harvey lately. She's an artist, British English artist, singer. I'm sure some of you are familiar with her. I think she is an artist. Like, she's the antithesis of Taylor Swift. PJ Harvey is an actual artist, like, in my view, from what I've heard, and I like her stuff, and I think she's the real deal, But she had this album, Let England Shake, I think is the album title, and I was curious. Some of the lyrics, I think, are like, Let England Shake is borrowed, I think, from a Wolf and Irish rebel song uh, called Let England Quake. And there's a line in the song, Let England Quake, or something. But this is in relation to Armunn's comment about nationalism. And, like, I know PJ Harvey listened to kind of Irish music. She was interested in it. So it's possible that she did borrow, like, the lyrical concept from an Irish rebel song. But, like, I went back and I was looking at the lyrics of the Irish rebel song. Obviously I'm Irish and from Ireland, and it just felt like I was looking at something from a different dimension. And I had some faint echo recollection of some connection to that feeling of nationalism, but it belongs to a different psyche and a different time. So it no longer any resonance, or it doesn't have any place in this reality. But at that time, it had a certain, there was a certain shared feeling. We mentioned the American dream a while ago, and so there's a dream there somewhere. There's a concept that may ignite people in a certain way, and that may, in turn, it's sort of, that feeling is interwoven with this concept of nation, perhaps. So it's a very difficult thing to pin down, and but it's also quite a controversial thing, because, as we all know now, it's against the the appointed narrative to have any sense of nation. and we must, except for the new nation, which, as Armunn points out, is the global nation. That one we're okay with. Once it's multicultural and vanilla, and it ticks all the boxes, that's okay. We dare not have any sort of feeling of our energy of the people around us. But I think at a certain point in time, it may have been a legitimate, and was a legitimate feeling, and it was political, and it was economic, and it was social, because some of what was nation was determined by what nation was not. And because of the machinations of what we now know as globalism has manifested as globalism, but before it became globalism, there was a multiplicity of wars. And there were impacts on local populations, there were famines, there were people had to struggle against an enemy, a perceived enemy, or a real enemy. So that enemy perhaps was necessary for that formation of nation, because nation needed an other in some senses, and in other senses nation did not need another, because nation could have, it evolved around language, around music, around art, and tribal sensibilities, around a sense of mythology, around a kind of a psyche, around a sense of humor, around food, around the landscape, around those people, be it mountainous or desert, or wherever they happen to be. So they evolved their own sense of identity. And even in a multiplicity of nations, as was the case in Ireland, you mentioned it in Spain as well, Armunn, but it was definitely the case in Ireland as well. We had a multiplicity of kind of small kingdoms, as it were. And but I still think, to finish my point, what I think is this concept of nation is like a concept of family. It somehow is a natural order. It's a natural organizing template for how people sort of how they socially organize themselves. So eventually, we begin to identify as a nation. So if you want me to use an extended kind of metaphorical kind of, or an extension of the idea, perhaps now we on the call here, and perhaps if anyone's listening who is enjoying the conversation and feels they can relate to it, perhaps we're somehow, there's a feeling of group, a shared ideas, shared sensibility. So those kinds of things are natural, and to feel, to want to belong to a group, and that a group should have larger reflection of how we feel. It enthuses us. It gives us a feeling of belonging, and so I do think, or did think, that the national as such did have a place at a certain point in time. But I think it's perhaps dead now. Like, I don't want to believe it's dead, but I fear it's dead, and I fear that that's again back to what this perhaps this Trump character is a manifestation of, the death of nation and the triumph of he's the corporate renegade boss that wants to fix everything. And
But I would
he's
say,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I would say, Zeal, that I agree with what you say, that organically there is this much needed sense of family and of belonging. Absolutely. But that, in my opinion, is not the nation. Because the nation is an amalgamation of families that probably organically would not be together. You understand? It's like a forced, in the same way that you feel now perhaps uncomfortable in a multicultural setting like Ireland is becoming.
Yeah.
Imagine that, you would feel the same way in when the UK was being formed, right? And the Welsh had to deal with the Brits, and the Brits with the Normans,
Well,
and the Saxons with
some of us
the
still feel like that. Some of us
right,
still feel like that in the UK. Yeah.
right. So what I'm trying to say is that it's forced only at a smaller scale than the globalization is, which does not mean, and I am perfectly aware and I agree with you with that sense of belonging, does not mean that you don't have a natural, let's say, place that you would belong to in that sense, right? And even create a culture and even, all of those things that you mentioned. But these are not nation. What I'm saying is that nation is a necessary stepping stone for globalization. Right? Without the nation, you can't then unite them. It's the
Yeah.
same way that the Roman Empire would be ruled by provinces, right? So the provinces of the Roman Empire basically became the nations of Europe, if you look at it,
Or
right?
the states of the
Or
USA. They
Or the
act in a similar manner, yeah.
correct, right? So first you create these
Mm.
subdivisions, and these subdivisions are actually what makes the empire unified later on, or in the process. So because and that happens because the process to create a nation is entirely the same at a smaller scale than the globalization is. And listen, I have been recently looking, like I've said, into the history of Japan. And Japan was exactly the same thing. Japan had, each clan had its territory. They had their own languages, dialects, ideas, culture, different, everything different. Meiji Restoration occurs. Now we're all Japan, right?
Yeah.
And now we have one language. And now we have one religion. And now we have one way of thinking. Right? It's exactly the same. And then, of course, you move people around. Right? So you were in this clan. Now you go across the country to the faraway province, and you know nobody. But you're Japanese. It doesn't matter if you came from Kyushu or Hokkaido or Okinawa. It doesn't matter, right? You're Japanese. You understand what I'm trying to say? So it's, in my opinion, the nation is not the pillar of that organic belonging that you're talking about. That would be the family or the tribe, if you want. But the nation is already an amalgamation, a multicultural amalgamation
Well, it's
necessary.
it's not necessarily that it's just an amalgamation. It's like what you're saying. It's something that's artificial. I mean, even for
Yeah.
example, in Scotland, I will get a lot of hate by saying this. I don't see the west of Scotland culturally as the same as me. I don't see I have nothing basically nothing in common culturally speaking with Glaswegians, other than obviously probably junk food or that, right?
And drinking.
And yeah, well, I don't drink, so yeah, but yeah, but yeah, if
Yeah.
I was a drinker, absolutely. But I saw the same thing as well when I was in Ireland, and of course I'm a foreigner, an outsider, but it was something I touched upon. Dublin has a completely different feeling. It actually feels almost. Again, I'll probably get a lot of hate by saying this, quite controversial. It feels like a British city, right? Of course, for
it is
obvious
a British
reasons.
city.
Completely different from the west of Ireland. That almost
Amen.
felt more like well, firstly, I mean it looked of course like Scotland. Firstly.
Yeah.
But I could feel there was a I mean Dublin was it felt completely distant from
Yeah.
Ireland's shared history. And when you go to the
Mhm.
west, where I was running along the up in the hills and along the old famine roads, right? And
Yeah.
I remember it dawned upon me when I was, along this road and across the landscape of the west of Ireland. Um, it's similar to Scotland in a way because we had it was almost the reverse, right? For example, you had the famine. The famine, I mean, was it was certainly induced. The famine was induced, and all of the other terrible atrocities that occurred against Ireland and its people, all of that was induced, and it made me wonder: was it induced to create this sort of simulated meaning that would eventually amalgamate into the Free Irish Republic? And in a similar way, Scotland had all of these this sort of simulate. It really was a simulated the way the history is written anyway. It was a simulated battle against the English. What a lot of the Scots don't actually realise is that Scotland was a complete and utter patchwork of allegiances, and it was all clan based, family based, tribe based, right? And you still have that today. And I can agree with Armunn, because if you didn't have law and order in Scotland, meaning the jackboot of the state, I can assuredly tell you, even in the 21st century, it would resort very quickly back to little petty kingdoms and villages. And I mean, you have to. It's changed slightly now, but if you go into the wrong village and they don't know your face, you're probably going to get hiding if you're not, accompanying or accompanied by a local. It's because people are tribal. But the thing is, see, people are tribal only within, pardon me, only within the Dunbar number. So anything above 150, really, unless you have a lot of these simulated or artificial psychological weaponizations of culture and what have you, basically the inversion of the organic, you basically can't, people can't maintain it psychologically within themselves. This is why, for example, we have wars. It creates that simulated meaning, right? And this is how you sort of psychologically coax people to go beyond the Dunbar number, to go beyond that 150 person psychological bond number, to maintain these artificial systems. Yeah, and of course, nations are one of those. Globalization is another. That's a more commercially focused thing. Nationalism is more a militaristic focused thing. But yeah, absolutely. All of this is an inversion of the family, or it's an inversion of the local area. For example, just from my experience, when I was in your area, Zeal, that is complete. I mean, it's literally night and day from Dublin. I mean, there's very little connection between the two, other than, of course, the tricolour and the state apparatus. And that's what I felt, But I agree, yeah. There is a connection to the blood and the soil, and it's something that organically occurs. But I think there is an inversion, of course, that takes place, which allows states to form, nationalist states to form, and of course later on globalized systems as well.
Yeah. Well, I'd agree really that there's definitely a very good point there that the nation can be viewed as a forerunner to globalization, because you need, once you have the nation set up, then you can put them to war, and eventually they fall like dominoes, and that's when you arrive at unipolarity, But I mean, it's like talking about an old love affair. When you're brought up, for example, in Ireland, you have a very romantic view of nation. It's inculcated and kind of brainwashed into you from a very young age, and you have the evidence of history to compound it, and it's very difficult to see outside of it. But I suppose with the benefit of time, you get a little bit older and you start to learn a bit more about the world. You begin to realize how the structure, how it was manipulated, really, and how it was created.
Mm-hmm.
But ironically, just to use the Irish example, most of the national the national patriots, in inverted commas, and those who started the struggle against colonial rule by Britain, were in fact from the Anglo-Irish stock.
Yeah.
So the leaders of 1916, Wolfe Tone and these people, and Stuart Parnell, all these people are basically from
We were the
Ireland.
same with our War of Independence. Of course,
Yeah.
I'm actually from these Norman families, but they were all Norman families. The Balliols, De Bruce. I mean,
Yeah.
none of them were, Scots. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Oh, the cat's after ripping me here. But yeah, no, but we're brought up with it. Then you've got to try and see through it, but it's back again to that Armunn's point with the book. It's you end up with this kind of mass hypnosis, mass hallucination. That's like a fake. It's false, but it becomes real because everyone sort of believes it, and it's then you're left with trying to deal with it. Like it's like you're growing up in it, and you have to kind of. It's a nightmare because it's like being in a cult, growing up in a cult. Like it's
It's exactly that. It's exactly
yeah.
that. Yes.
I think there was one Irish writer that said history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. I don't know, was it Sean O'Casey or someone,
That's a
but I
superb
think maybe
quote.
they'd arrived at that point. They'd arrived at that point where they understood that, and they were trying to shake off history itself, and they were trying to do an archaeological dig to try and rediscover themselves under the pile of rubble of propaganda and inculcation and just all the lies and narrative they've been fed. He's trying to strip it off one layer at a time to see, well, who am I under all this? Like,
This
I
also
think
reminds me
I think
is
Kazumba wants to jump in. So
yeah.
sorry.
Oh, actually, I'll just say, from a structural point of view, that it seems that you guys are circling around identity, in reference to the relationship between amplitude and resolution. As in, the more amplitude that you have, the less resolution of identity you will have. So, for example, as in a nation, you will feel much less of a belonging than you will feel within a city or within a tribe or within a village and whatnot. So there is this intricate relationship here, as Silas was stating, that stipulates an optimal point to which you actually feel belonging and familiar. And very quickly, I will actually point out, you guys were discussing the Narciso. I would say that it comes primarily from a contemplation as a byproduct of either beauty or intellect. But these two are not self-evident, making the narcissistic self, require an external mirror as a validation that confirms that evidence, not in equivalence, but by contrast, not by equivalence as a normal mirror would, but by contrast, of course. So there is this existential need in the narcissistic individual to have objects or other subjects that are objectified as references for his own confirmation or for his own evidence of value. And Silas, you brought up a very good point regarding hunger, if they use that to bring up meaning. And I would definitely say that it was the case, because if you view hunger as a condition that forms a circumstance, you can essentially infer that it is an implication of difference, meaning if in this specific circumstance, if nothing is done, then the status quo will change. Therefore, it requires a specific operation, something to be done, but that first needs to be modulated both in property and in direction, meaning how, if everything changes and differs, how it will differ, within what bounds and limits, and in which direction it will go. So already there, like just from a simple condition that can naturally arise within a society or within the smallest sociological group, it can definitely be manipulated very easily into a specific direction and a modality, and and that's so yeah, I definitely think the problems arise naturally, but the manipulation is contingent and consequent.
I
100%.
totally agree. And you brought up that really superb point, which is this, no pun in, well, no irony intended, but this contrast between contrast and equivalence. And it's the same
Yeah.
idea that really revolves around the narcissist, right? And narcissist obviously comes from Narcissus, that's a Greek mythological figure. And I posted, God, it was a wee while back now, probably about almost an hour ago now. I was meant to bring it up to you guys, but I guess never, better late than never. And what you see in this, I think it was the painter Correggio, I forget his first name, but he painted this in the 18th or 19th century, and it's essentially a superb illustration of the philosophical questions surrounding Narcissus and the narcissist, and even what Armunn's mentioning, right, and what we're all mentioning here regarding basically the artificial, and that idea that to get beyond the Dunbar number, you need a trauma bond. So you need to create either starvation, you need to create some form of humanitarian crisis, war, blood, some form of bloodletting, some sort of simulated event that produces in and of itself a consequent simulated meaning within uh, within the civilization or the social organism you're trying to create artificially. This itself creates a monomyth, which provides, again, um, I guess you could say a temporary meaning. So, for example, one example of this is that after World War II, you had the afterglow of the victory of World War II, which essentially informed both American foreign policy and American domestic policy and the Western civilization itself, right? They were on top. They felt as though liberalism was this force to be reckoned with, that it was the best way for the human species to go. And liberalism itself was this pious lie, this a noble fiction, which stated that America and the West, their system itself, enfranchised the human and observed the innate human, intrinsic worth of the human itself, right? And they were the only system that could do this. Therefore, they had to be the hegemon. So you had this afterglow. This afterglow itself, this was all artificial. It was created by the bloodletting, the mass sacrifice, needless sacrifice of World War I and World War II, which then has perpetuated this lie. Another lie, by the way, that branched off from this sort of afterglow of World War II, not accompanying neoliberalism, is basically Zionism, right? And that's something you're actually starting to see peter out as well, because again, people are seeing through the artificial nature of it. By the way, Israel is a similar formula that's being played out as we saw with the Crusader states, which interestingly had
The
a
holy, the
similar.
holy city blueprint. The holy city
Exactly.
blueprint.
Exactly. And in the same way it perpetuated itself and persisted. I think it was around about 200 years or so the Crusader states persisted until Salah ad-Din conquered the city. So these things replay themselves out. Another example of this, by the way, this created simulated meaning in the artificial nation or artificial idea, whatever it may be, through this induced calamity or induced despair and anguish in a people to bind them together artificially. Again, trauma bonding, which itself permits the population to go beyond the Dunbar number, so you can create nations and federations and global federations or regional or continental federations as well. You see the same thing in Africa today. So food and starvation in Africa, and also war and civil war, is also used as well to not just reshape the geopolitical landscape of Africa, but also to reshape the minds of Africans themselves. So, for example, now most of the nations of Africa are completely artificial. I mean, if you were to look at the tribal territories and lines, I mean, for one example, Liberia. Liberia has over 300 languages. I think actually it's over 350 languages. That country is complete. I mean, it's tearing itself apart. I believe they're going through a civil war right now. But that itself was, firstly, it was created after decolonization. But the only way it persisted was basically through calamity. It was through the afterglow of decolonization. It was through the sort of psychological impetus that provided to the population, and also the tumultuousness of food insecurity and financial insecurity and all of this. But again, it's temporary. That's why we now see the civil wars going on here. I mean, there's other reasons for that too. But the sort of the psychological, I guess you could call it bulwark, or the noble lie, the pious fiction of Nigeria, for example, is beginning to break down. Right, Sudan's another one that's breaking down. That's already broke down once with the severance of Sudan into South Sudan and Sudan proper. So these things are these nations themselves. They don't they're fictions, right? It's not just the African nations, which were drawn up by the imperialists of the 19th century. It's even the borders that have been crafted through wars over however many hundreds of years, for example, in Europe, right? Those things themselves are completely fictional. They are. I mean, Scotland, for instance, is a fiction, total fiction. The Scots are not a unified entity. I know that just by living here. I mean, even the English is that's another example. So you have the major divide between the south of England and the north of England. The north of England, funnily enough, I actually probably have more in common with, because I've travelled down there quite a lot, and culturally I feel more acclimatized to that, those areas like Northumbria and Cumbria, than I would in Glasgow. I know, because I've been to Glasgow, I've been to these places, so I feel like an alien in Glasgow. I don't feel like an alien in Northumbria and Cumbria. So or for example in Aberdeen or Inverness is not quite as bad, but so it's to me these things are already fictional. I felt at home in Ireland, but when I'm speaking to Irish people, I can quickly realize I don't have the same culture as them. The Irish, I feel, are far more gregarious than the Scots. The Scots are quite gregarious as well, but so you get all of these cultural differences, and yeah, I agree. I mean, Scotland wouldn't be a nation unless it was, through whatever means, be the historical record real or not, it was bound together through simulated meaning, right? Or through, of course, just sheer force. Yeah, and I
I would
think
like.
as well. Yeah, jump in.
Sorry.
Sorry, man.
No, I would just like to, but it will change the subject. Finish your point. Sorry.
Yeah, just really quickly with Narcissus. So it's that idea that you see with Lucifer and John Milton's Paradise Lost. So it's the notion that Narcissus falls in love, of course, with his own reflection. But his reflection itself, it's like what Cazumbo's stating, it's not necessarily an equivalence. And I don't like Michel Foucault, but he brought up this point, which is the heterotopia. For example, what you see in the mirror isn't actually your reflection. It is it's the pure substitution of you, right? No, sorry, no, you're like, it's what you see as your reflection, but it's the pure substitution of your true form. That's what I'm meaning to say. And you brought this up, Armunn, with the analogy of the tree.
Yeah. Mm.
So if you begin to believe that the mind character or the shadow or that which contrasts you is in fact your equivalence, what you're actually doing is you're bypassing your own organic essence, and you're choosing to believe the collective or collectivized script, or in this case the contrast, right, which itself contains in it a sort of poison, right? And you actually see this poison rearing its ugly head. And this will be my final point, just really quickly. And you were mentioning it, Zeal, and I feel it myself, right? I have this what psychologists call anemoia, and it's this sort of romantic or romanticization of or nostalgia for a time you've actually never known or never lived in. And you actually find this usually at the end of civilizations, and you find a lot of very beautiful works of art, actually, very lamentations, deep and philosophical ideas and poetry and all of this. It's because basically you're at a point of historical exhaustion. Again, the noble lie or the pious fiction is breaking down. So you have a sort of it's what you're experiencing isn't actually a real memory, right? And I had to actually go through this myself. It's not for example, when I run the hills of Scotland or walk the Munros, and I listen to the old Scottish music, and I feel like I'm Scottish, right? And I look up to the sky and thank God I was born a Scotsman, not an Englishman. That itself is based upon a lie. Because fundamentally what it is it's not a real memory. It's basically a curated spectacle that's born of, for example, Hollywood films, like Braveheart or Rob Roy or what have you. And it's born of this idea of what it means to be Scottish.
Yeah.
Which, anyone else, for example, Armunn, right, or Cazumbo, or even Sayo, or even yourself, you wouldn't understand, right? It's something, of course, it's a personal spectacle, but it's curated nonetheless by an external force. For example, I meet a lot of Indians, right? Now I'm going to be honest, their cultural practices are so completely alien to me, I can't understand them. But they actually think my cultural practices are completely, the same. They can't understand them. They think they're alien. Even some of them have stated they think they're they're backwards. So, for example, even hygiene, right? There's, for example, we sit on toilets. They don't. They find that unhygienic. But I find other things that they do unhygienic, which they find actually hygienic, right? Or other cultural practices in terms of how they eat, what they eat. I would find that, completely, alien or foreign to me. I wouldn't understand it. I couldn't empathize with it. But to them, it's completely normal. Again, because fundamentally humans have the same nature, right? If we were left to our own devices, we would generally form our own cultures organically. But when you have a curated culture, and believe you me, the Indian culture is curated. You have the same problem as you do in Nigeria, as you do in Scotland. You have languages that are regional. I think you have about the same 300 to 400 languages in India. I mean, India is a subcontinent. It's not a country. It's the same with the USA. The USA is a continental superpower. It's not actually a nation. But of course, you try saying that to the Americans, right? That a person from
Same with
Michigan.
China.
It,
Same with
it's same with
China.
China. Bingo, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Mhm.
And so all of these basically what I'm saying is that anemoia, that nostalgia for a time you've never lived, and trying to escape backwards because you feel that the future is captured or it's hollow. Um, Fundamentally, it's it's an outgrowth of the understanding of the organic self, that actually there was no authenticity in the big noble lie or pious fiction of the nation or whatever it may be to begin with. But because you're still stuck in the mind character or whatever it may be, and believe you me, I myself am stuck in that to some degree. You're constantly looking back. You're trying to find authenticity in a culture that's already in a post-truth, post-authenticity era. It's severed itself from it. It's effectively undead. Yeah, sorry, I've went on a bit of a rant, but I don't know if
No, no, all
jump in.
excellent points, and I'm glad that you brought Narcissus back, because that was what I wanted to address. And one of the versions, and that's the version that I adhere more, of the Narcissus myth, is the one where Narcissus does not fall in love with his image by seeing his image. The full story in that version is that the nymph Echo is in love with Narcissus, but Echo has a curse cast upon her by Hera due to her jealousy of Zeus, because Zeus was a ladies' man, as depicted, as you know. And the curse is that Echo can only repeat the last words she hears. She can't speak her own words. Okay. And when the nymph Echo is in love with Narcissus, she chases him into the woods, and Narcissus looks upon the pond and sees his reflection, and the nymph approaches him. The Echo approaches him and tries to tell him in desperation that she loves him, right? But what she hears is Narcissus say, "Wow, I'm beautiful," right? And she tries to say, "I love you," and she says, "I'm beautiful." And the nymph, being a nymph, has the power to influence the emotion. So he falls in love with his own reflection, because the nymph imbued in him her magic of falling in love with that image. And then he says, "Wow," because now he feels, enamored. And he says to the reflection, "I love you." And the nymph repeats, "I love you," because she can only repeat. And then it solidifies even more, right? So this is the version that I think is best to me, because you see that reinforcement of repetition, right, of an idea that comes from this magical external worldview, to promote that love of the reflection, not of the original or of the other that would otherwise be, the worthy center of your affections, right? That's the point that I wanted to make to complement.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. There's also another telling of the Narcissus myth that I remember coming across some time back as well. But yeah, that absolutely a very good point. Something else I've noticed with a lot of Greek myths is that you brought up Echo, and of course we're on Discord right now, and Discordia is another Greek goddess.
Mhm.
But it's weird that we're in a of course, well, we're in a post-Christian era, but we're still supposedly in a sort of Christian slash Judeo-Christian, just Abrahamic era. Yet we still see these recurring, well, for lack of a better term, echoes of that past constantly creeping up again and again and again. it makes you wonder if these, I mean, are these archetypes, is there some sort of organic nature to the old gods, you know, that's found deeply within perhaps not the essence, but perhaps the ego? You know, is there an epigenetic
Nothing,
memory to all of this?
nothing that is presented in the worldview is built out of that comparison, because it's only
Mhm.
effective once it mimics the organic. So there has to be an equivalent archetype, or essential potential, or whatever it is, something in the structure that is represented by that. Otherwise it doesn't work. For these worldviews, and that's one of the major points that I make in the book, is that for these worldviews to work, to function, to be appealing to the individual has to feel that they are the actual truth. And for that, they have to identify. I mean, it's like, if you, I don't know, if you put a dog in front of a TV, right? And there's a rabbit running in the TV, the dog is going to chase. It's his first, right? Because he thinks that there's an actual rabbit there. So there's an instinct in the dog that tells him, oh, that is prey, that is delicious, that is to hunt and eat, right? But it's a reflection. So he goes across and he sees, oh, the prey disappeared, because of course it's an image on the TV, right? The prey disappeared. But probably in his memory he thinks, oh, that square there, or that rectangle there, has prey inside, or something like that. I'm of course just projecting how the dog would probably think. I'm not saying it is that way, but it's merely a metaphor to say that everything false has to be effective, mimic the organic. There's even small poem by Antonio Aleixo, who is a Portuguese poet, that says, for a lie to have depth, it has to have in it something of the truth. And that is exactly how the world is work. So for sure, it has to be a correlation, archetypal or structural, to anything organic in the psyche, for sure.
And there's something as well to mention, that narcissism itself, what we know as narcissism today, would have been known to the ancient Greeks as hubris. And hubris was actually one of their equivalent terms, and even it was actually a criminal category as well in certain ancient Greek policies, of blasphemy, and it was trying to be like the gods. And well, it states here, in ancient Greek, hubris referred to outrage, actions that violated the natural order, or which shamed and humiliated the victim, sometimes for the pleasure or gratification of the abuser. Another, again, based upon another goddess in her name, the goddess Hybris is described in the Encyclopedia Britannica 11th edition as having insolent encroachment upon the rights of others, right? So you have this sort of tyranny aspect in this too, right? And so uh, you see throughout all of these terms that we've brought up, there's this constant recurring theme, that which of course relates back to your book, right? What you mentioned of how the psyche is, or the ego is artificially controlled, how the world is turned into almost a psychological containment, uh, um, uh, corralment or trap for the psyche itself, right? To bury it. Um,
Yeah, I would
and you
just
see,
correct. I would
yeah,
just correct real quickly that what is trapped is not the ego. The ego is simply cut off from contact. What is trapped is the mind character, in relation to a projection of the ego that it
yes,
forms. Right. But just to correct that small point, go ahead.
absolutely. Sorry, yes, absolutely. So this gets us on to the hoax indicators, and
Mhm.
I actually think it'd be great for the listeners to, if we just read them out. I mean, they're absolutely superb. Um, I'll just go to them quickly.
Credit to Tim Osman.
Yes, credit to Tim Osman. These are
Yeah.
superb. And so, of course, stop me if you want to comment on them, both Cazumbo, Armunn, and Sayo as well. So the first one is that of the ready to implement political agendas. Real events tend not to have the problem, reaction, solution template attached. Number 2, crisis actors. Mass casualty simulations employ actors, as do simulated news events. These are characteristically exhibiting inappropriate emotions. Many are seemingly coached in their testimony, and oftentimes their version of events are inconsistent with the official story. Probably even historically you had this as well, but because you now have social media, mass media, and recording devices, both audio and visual recording, we now can obviously critique their performances, which of course you couldn't do historically prior to these technologies. 3, relevant concurrent programming in contemporaneous entertainment media. Concurrently released mainstream entertainment indicate the event was scheduled to occur at that time and was not a spontaneous occurrence. 4, concurrent
vital.
drills that... Exactly. Yes, exactly. 4,
Yeah.
concurrent drills that align with the theme of the fake event. Jump in, please.
No, I was just gonna that is vital because it is what provides reality to the possibility, right? Because what happens is what is usually called predictive programming, which I call pre-program, is that, for example, in movies or whatever, you see new possibilities that never occurred to you, right? So, for example, you're seeing a sci-fi movie in the 50s or the 40s or whatever, and they're using something in their hands that they talk to and it's wireless, which would be for us the smartphone, right? For them, it's something that was never imagined, right? So it's a wow, like oh, could it be that one day, etc., right? And then concurrent to the release, and I'm not saying that, of course, smartphones work, but concurrent to the release of the actual device, you have something that solidifies that possibility, right? So first you open the door, then as you're about to push the person through the door, you have to provide an impetus, right? It solidifies that this door leads to truth, leads to an actual organic thing, right? And so that's what concurrent programming does, and that is absolutely vital. And that is why I think he listed as one of the hoax indicators. But I think it's a key one.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you're also, again, through that simulated meaning, like what we were talking about with the formations of nations and even globalized trading empires or what have you. Effectively, what you're doing is you're crafting, or you're bewitching the populace so you can entice their complicity, and through that you're manufacturing consent essentially.
Mhm.
Through again that emotional connection, through basically like what you're saying, creating out of the fiction a sort of tangibility to it, right? Something that's
Yes,
real.
yes, that is exactly it. Create tangibility out of what would otherwise be fiction, you know, and even probably be perceived, because the effect that has is probably, and I say this speculatively, but probably if it wasn't for concurrent programming, and this we're talking about, stuff like Netflix, which is prevalent nowadays. It became like the standard of entertainment. When I say Netflix, I say Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney, and those streaming kind of services. Um, what they do is they actually, tell you that this is possible, and not only possible, it is real. And without that, if people weren't exposed to that, they would probably look at a given event that is, in the concurrent programming and have doubts, right? Because it wasn't, if exposed, let's say in cold, right, out of the blue, in cold, like we are, because usually we don't pay attention to these platforms unless we're studying some symbology or whatever. So we're doing that completely conscious of what we're watching. We know that we're watching propaganda, right? But for people that think they're just being entertained by a movie or whatever, or a documentary or whatever, or even a news report, right? They don't see the difference. And when they are exposed to the event, they treat it as real because of all that previous triggering and previous programming that occurred, right? When perhaps if exposed coldly to the event, they would have doubts. Is this really happening? I mean, really? Would this be, you understand, there would be at least that doubt, even if the doubt didn't last, there would at least be that innate resistance to confirming that as real. So go ahead, sorry.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I actually wanted to ask Cazumbo if he had any thoughts upon these hoax indicators that we've discussed thus far, or of course your comments as well, Armunn.
Yeah, Cazumbo, go ahead.
I'd say, complementing both of you, that it is a weaponization of interest, which is the willingness to engage, but engagement itself is most intense when it deals with fiction, with what it doesn't know entirely yet. So there is an element that is known, that is direct, and there is that indirect element that, as Armunn said, hints or pre-programs that idea. So as a manipulation, being it through movies, through media, whatever type of platform they will use to do so, there is already this play with what the people are interested in, which is the direct and the real in our current reality, and then the implementation of what is indirect that could potentially be created as a consequence of our current reality. So at heart, we see that media becomes very powerful, not just because it can communicate ideas, but the self will not realize that he is being manipulated because he's just that deeply or superficially interested in what's being presented, right? And the dimensions of that object, which are the fictional, or perhaps you can even call it mythical ones, are not attainable to him, I would say, at the essential level. So you could say there's a direct, an indirect, and an essential level. And that person sees the direct level, which already compromises his imagination, but doesn't complement the indirect picture, which is being manipulated by those that have an essential oversight of everything being put at place.
Yeah, the overview. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I agree.
Go on, Silas.
Superb points. So again, just stop me if anyone has any comments they want to make. But continuing on with the list, 5. Celebrity involvement in an event is a good indicator that it is an influence operation. And we'll also tie this in with, of course, real world events. Armunn, you mentioned the COVID-19 event as well, which, of course, that fits almost exactly all of these. It does actually fit all of these hoax indicators. Funnily enough, as well, there's also a PSYOP indicator list, which I came across, funnily enough, quite recently, quite a synchronicity. And COVID-19 also, I think it was like over 90%. The indicator gives you a sort of a number, a measure of its PSYOP level, and COVID-19 was something like 90%. So yeah, 6. Does the perpetrator reference other questionable events? Does the perpetrator fit a predictable stereotype targeted at striking fear into a target demographic? And of course, we found with COVID-19 that was this phantom of the virus, right?
Yeah.
Which was similar, as you mentioned, Armunn, to demonology. The UFO deception was also similar to demonology. In fact, I'm pretty sure there was a book called The UFO Deception that came out in the early 80s or late 70s that made this actual claim and linked it back to CIA projects and such.
Yeah.
7, deviations from standard protocol.
Let me just comment on that part about the perpetrator, because okay, here we're talking about a mythical thing, like a virus, because you've never had contact with you. No one has ever seen properly a virus per se. So, but let's put that into a different psyop for people to see. Do you remember that recent stabbing of a Ukrainian girl in the subway?
Our Naya, I forget her second name now, but Arnaya,
Irina something. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that fits because it says there, does the perpetrator fit a stereotype? Yes. Who stabs the blonde girl? It's the black man, right?
Yeah.
And why the black man? Because that was directed at the right of the political spectrum that are now concerned about the illegal immigrants and this and that, and that see the multicultural and the racial thing as the enemy, right? So they were programmed to see that. So of course that the hoax, the psyop, will play into that, right? Who is it? It's like target marketing, right?
Oh yeah.
Who is it directed to? It's directed at the right. So if it's directed at the right, of course that in that region and for that demographics, the perpetrator is a black man, right? And of course that what is the discussion that emerged afterwards? Oh yeah, I knew. Yeah, the black crime and the this and the that. You could see it all over, right?
Oh no, you
The
had you
response,
had the invented term of black fatigue right after that.
right? Black.
That's what hit just out of nowhere, you know.
That is the agenda. That is the readily implementable agenda. It's to create that division, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and listen, I am completely, at ease talking about this because here, Cazumbo, he is a black man, right? And I consider him like one of the brightest. I've told him several times, one of the brightest minds I've ever come across. Yeah. And so, people have that thing that you were talking about, the stereotypes, that is programmed in exactly to be triggered later. So first you spend decades being programmed, right?
Yeah.
With these races or these peoples or these culture or these whatever
Religions, or yeah.
religion, etc. And then you trigger with these events because it's directed at the demographics that were programmed previously by that. So just to prove that point with something a bit more that people can relate better to. Go ahead.
What's interesting about that, Arina or Rina, whatever her name was, Zaruska, I think that was her second name, is that people didn't question it, that the CCTV camera appeared to be almost directed towards her. And you also saw the other side of them. All of the passengers were black as well. And they didn't help her at all, right? So again, it's call me a conspiracy theorist. It looks like it's created for, theater or dramatic effect.
It is directed. It is target marketing. You create these things because that is the expectation that has been programmed before, right?
Yeah.
If you expect, it's like, imagine that you're debating with your mates that, oh yeah, the problem here with this country are the black people, right? And your mates go, nah, no, come on, you're just a racist, whatever, right? And then this comes along, completely staged, completely made for that
Yeah.
particular point, and then you can say, see, I was right. And even if those mates that he was talking to point out that, well, but the cameras, don't they seem strange, or the absence of blood, or the strange behavior of the intervenient, right? That will not compute because he's already decided that it has to be real because it confirms his pre-programmed worldview. You
Exactly.
understand?
Yeah.
Because he equates, of course, I have been telling you for years that black men are dangerous, right? And so it plays into that. And of course, he was going to treat it as real because it validates a pre-programmed point of view. Absolutely. It's 100% target marketing.
Believe as well that Arinya Zaruska. I believe
Hmm.
she was also an actress as well. She was a model. She was in music videos and things like that. That's another thing you tend to find with a lot of this. So again,
Yeah.
that brings us back to the crisis actors. But
Right.
you even find, for example, another instance of this, which is a little a little more historic, but the Rodney King beating.
Right. Right.
And then,
Uh-huh.
so basically, this is what they've created, is that they've essentially, and social media, by the way, is accelerated this tenfold. They've basically racialized all of society while at the same time claiming that we, it's a multicultural society and all of this. So through their target marketing, like what you've mentioned, is they've radicalized every side. They've divided
Sure.
everyone along these fault lines. And so, what it actually does, and what it feels like for, I guess, most people, right, if they're social media addicts, is that they're seeing all of this constant. I mean, on Twitter, for example, if it's almost like Twitter is trying to radicalize you in these specific directions, right? Be it religious or racialist or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, and it feels totally engineered as well. I mean, you could go on Twitter, you could just watch video game content, and you're still going to be, absolutely bombarded with politicized crap, because that's what it's doing. But ultimately, it wants engagement. It wants engagement. It's like what we're talking about, right? With, for example, as I mentioned to Zeal, with the old famine road or the induced Irish famine, or even the wars, the bloodletting, all of these simulated events that are designed to create simulated meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's it's the same idea with the sort of racialized multicultural society, which itself actually is a complete. It should be a paradox, but to
Yeah.
these the social engineers, it's not, because fundamentally what you're doing is you're creating two types of simultaneously existing nations within the same nation, right? What I mean by that is, on one side, well, actually, there's several, but just along the racial aspects, you have one side which is um, the, I guess you would call it the natives or indigenous, right? And they're being hit with social media with racialized propaganda, which also is sort of, you know, uh, attached to that is religious propaganda, political propaganda. So they're creating a sort of carefully contrived camp um, of a specific brand of nationalism, right? And then on the other side, you have the sort of incumbents, the incomers, and they themselves are hit with this, what they feel to be, is discrimination through political propaganda, right? It's the same sort of idea. They racialize as well. And what it
Yeah.
creates is it creates two competing nationalistic forces, which through their engagement with one another, they actually prop up, in a weird paradoxical way, the society itself, right? Not necessarily the multicultural idea of the society, but the
No,
society itself, you know? Jump in, man,
the
sorry.
way that is done is metaphorically, when you're distilling a drink, when you're distilling, for example, whiskey,
Yeah.
right? What you do is you have this, let's say, liquid which has impurities in it, with what is considered impurities for what you want. Okay? This is a metaphor, right? So the only way that you can clear out those impurities is to set fire, so apply heat to the liquid, so that the actual spirit, let's say, of that liquid transfers into a different container, right? Through the distillation, through the alembic, and the leftover, so the parts that you don't want are left behind. And I think that this radicalization on both sides,
Mhm.
left side, right side, that will be removed. That is the leftover. You understand? What they are
Yes.
doing is a process of distillation, in the sense of, you apply fire, you put these impurities one against the other, and they will be left behind in that sense. You understand? The others,
Oh, no,
and,
absolutely.
and of course, I'm not saying that their view is pure, okay? What I am trying to say is that in this metaphor, they
Yeah.
want to make whiskey. And if they want to make whiskey, they can't have the impurities, right? So they apply fire to distill. That's basically it.
That's exactly, I think, what's behind the term melting pot, right? And it was something, it was actually developed by a Kabbalist in the early 1900s. And this was used to describe the great American drama. But fundamentally, I mean, it's another thing I was going to mention is that by both sides, by this sort of these two opposing brands of simultaneously existing nationalism, right? The incomers and the quote quote incomers and the quote quote natives. Um, what it actually does, by the contrast between the two, is that in fact it doesn't just prop up the system and like what you're saying, create this sort of fire that produces the melting pot, this transmutation through the vaporous spirit or liquid, right? And the condensation of it in the next system, it actually props up both sides as well, right? So it perpetuates the fire. It's a self fueling, self-initiating, self-persisting fire. So what I mean by that is, for example, if if a white man, right, if he is on social media, which most, of course, most are, or a black man, it doesn't really matter, or an Indian, or whatever it may be, and they're seeing these types of uh, discrimination, what they perceive as discrimination through political propaganda on social media, then even if they're not racialist or religiously radical or whatever it may be, eventually they're going to feel as though they have to be, because it almost instigates, again artificially, this type of fight or flight response, right?
Of
It's
course,
a very instinctual, animalistic thing, and this is the
it's
same idea.
existential. Yeah, it becomes
Exactly.
existential. Yes.
Becomes existential. So it
Mhm.
maintains this fire in society. It creates the permacrisis. It creates the melting pot. Or
Mhm.
plot. Well, there's another thing. Yeah, the melting plot.
Nothing plot. Yeah.
So yeah, all of it's artificial. It's totally fictitious. Um, yeah, there was another thing that came out with Arena Zaruska. There was something right after. No, it was the Charlie. Was it the Charlie Kirk thing? Was right after that. And that was another
Yeah. Yeah.
thing. That was the sort of political divide, right? So
Yeah.
they were hitting every point, and I think just before that you had a sort of transgender story as well, right?
Yes.
And so
Mhm. The
only
transgender shooter. That was actually the last question he was answering before supposedly being shot. Yeah.
exactly, yes. So it was hitting all of these various fault lines that they want to, of course, maintain the chasmic divide of. So yeah, I mean, it's the same idea. You know, they're simulating meaning. There's
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know if you have any other points you want to add, Kazumbo or Armunn.
I would just say that, you know, what is direct becomes directed, you know. The direct is truth, or at the very least authentic, but without specification nor interpretation, which then becomes directed and embodies direction in order for the complementary and qualitative change where the conceptualized idea, I would say, gains agentic influence over the real world. And again, as I was saying before, I do feel that these problems naturally arise, but their solutions or how they are modulated in face of society is precisely a manipulation, a fine one, that comes as a pre-conceptualization. And I have this idea that whenever you are conceptualizing something, just like a woman in her period, you also are bound to be in are bound to suffer great shifts in balance, right? Because if conceptualization is an autonomous process, your automatic mechanism, if you have an internal one, would be suspended for a little bit of time, for the necessary time. And so, whenever that is happening, it is quite necessary that imbalances established so that that thing which is being conceptualized comes into life fully. So that is that element of chaos that always seems to precede the realization of an idea, whatever it might be, into our reality. And yeah, we're seeing this now with, I don't know, across various political spheres, but there is well, very generally, again, the left and the right, but there is this movement, especially now with you guys were mentioning the transgendered, that especially those on the extreme right feel very threatened by those on the extreme left, which is quite a shift in what you see. And we're seeing now again with Charlie Kirk being shot. We see with transgenders constantly forget the name of the verb, putting fires. And so there's this shift that it's trying to realize an idea. If it is authentic or not, that is debatable, but there's definitely something at play there.
Yeah, the mimicry of the organic process is always there. So
Yeah.
if otherwise it wouldn't take hold. So everything that is implemented has to follow a certain structure, regardless of how grotesque it becomes. It has to follow certain structural norms that are organic, that are mimicries of organic. So in that regard, it is correct. But it is important, and that is why I've included that in the book, to determine the hoax indicators, because they show which of these, because of course it is possible for, and it happens in the world that people hurt each other and so on and so forth and kill each other. Of course it happens. But what is, when these things have an impact, such as these hoax indicators have been showing, we can look at it from the perspective of that direction that you're mentioning. This is not because it's not unless we would consider God to be quite sadistic, it wouldn't be an act of God to synchronize all these things together. So it is an act of men that seek power and that want to direct society in a certain way, let's say. So, but yeah, they do have to mimic. It is absolutely essential to mimic the organic.
You coined a really fascinating term there, Cazumbo, agentic influence. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And so, for example, and this ties in with your comments as well, Armunn, that they're mimicking something that's organic. So, of course, anything that goes beyond the Dunbar number, again, because it's artificial and it's essentially like a spinning plate, it's spun through these artificial means, these simulated means, and but eventually you will lose. It will decelerate. It will lose balance, stability, and it will it will crash on the floor and smash into 1,000 pieces until some opportunist comes along and glues them all together and tries to spin the thing again. but
Yeah.
so but the thing is as well is that as that deceleration is occurring, which would be similar, of course, to what we've been discussing here with, I guess we would say we're at a point in our civilizational arc and life expectancy that it feels as though we're at a point of historical exhaustion, right? There's a stagnancy that's going on, and there at the same time, again paradoxically, there appears to be quite a lot of changes, right? There's a massive epochal shift that it feels tangible, and it almost feels as though, like what you're saying, Armunn, that's something, that historical exhaustion is something that is a natural process. And with that historical exhaustion, pardon me, with the mass urbanization, you start to get weird and strange behavior, right? And you start to see this with anything above the Dunbar number, right? Um, Neuroses and other things take hold, and you get a population that are, sort of lost in a morass and a meaninglessness, and a sort of Calhoun's mouse experiment. But in a way, it's almost like, for example, what you see with transgenderism, perhaps this gender fluidity and this need for self-actualization, right, upon the hierarchy of needs, is something that's, I mean, it's something that's desperately sought after by the population because they're trying to alleviate this sort of deep-rooted, perhaps meaninglessness that they have, or purposelessness that they may feel. But what the sort of hoax, the grandest hoax indicator of this, is that all of the terminology surrounding this transgender movement itself is it's completely fictitious. It's something
Yeah.
that's clearly designed to create an artificial sense of tribalism or of the in group, right? Which it's, I mean, it makes no sense. Why would you have that with effectively what are a group of cross-dressers or perhaps sexual mavericks, right? Which are, completely fine. They can do whatever
Well,
they feel like, but it almost feels as though they've grafted onto these personal lifestyles a sort of tribalistic mentality through the landscape of language, which itself indicates a hoax. But it's all just final point, like with what Cazumbo stated, this landscape, this artificial landscape through language and ideas and conceptions and framing that they've constructed artificially and grafted onto this lifestyle, it's actually created an agentic influence, meaning that the idea almost becomes like a living homunculus in a way. It becomes
Yeah,
this
yeah.
living thing, that takes on a life of its own. It's not quite life. It moves. It shuffles around. Perhaps it,
The
it
inf-
may motion, but it's not quite alive. It's like an uncanny valley effect.
It's
Jump
that
in, Cazumbo.
invisible hand, the famous one of Adam Smith. But one thing is important to mention, that qualitative. I always mess up this word. Qualitative. I'll just go on. Change is contractual, meaning that for the agentic influence of that idea or concept to move and gain proportion and measure in the real world, becoming tangible, there is a contractual step that determines the limits of that extension, the permissive and both the preventive limits of that extension, which is something that I am formulating myself. And the point about it being contractual is that this self or this selves as a society need this agreeableness that will naturally arise to what is being conditionally presented. And I say conditionally presented because given a specific implication, sociological or even more cosmic than that, even grander than that, you essentially have a condition that forces you to agree or come into an agreement with the limit itself, with what is being presented, and that creates that unification that can lead, as we were discussing before, to a nation. But at the psychological level, it creates that contract where the self unconsciously agrees to act in this way, which is very interesting because there is this anime called in Ghost in the Shell. It's quite futuristic, and they explore very well this idea of a stand complex. I don't know if it derived precisely from the anime or if it was explored by any philosopher, but it's the idea that there is an entity or perhaps a singular individual that is influencing or directing an idea that makes all these individuals rise to stand for something, but they fully believe that they are doing it alone. And it creates this really, really paradoxical state in which all of these individuals rising in rebellion believe themselves to be individually enlightened and standing for something that only they understand at the core, but they are forming a collective that, however, doesn't have a formed identity. It's that agentic influence that just isn't formed, but has a real influence in the world. And so that's very interesting. That there happens a contract happens, and we never realize it most of the time.
You had
Welcome
as
to the
well.
world view. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's very similar as well with what Cazumbo was mentioning, and even the worldview. You had that mimetic phrase, that meme magic, as they call it, of the snowflake. And the snowflake is a perfect analogy. It's again, if you were to project it as the meme does, you project it onto sociological topics. The idea of the snowflake, it believes as though it's unique, which, to some degree it is. But if you look at it from a grander vantage point, all of the snowflakes themselves take on the same structural components, the same structural or overarching structural aesthetic, right? And so fundamentally, it's a lie, right? But the individuality almost pushes. Again, if looking at it as a sort of sociological thing, the individuality or the belief in the individual being special or being radical or being, somehow avant-garde or whatever it may be, anti-system, that itself, in fact, emboldens the collective. A similar example is Saturnalia, which was the state used this sort of what appeared to be on the outset, right, on just the pure facade of it all, this anti-system, anti-establishment, inversion of the natural order. But fundamentally, the reason the state allowed Saturnalia is, in fact, it allowed a formal and prescribed, I guess you would say, venting for the public. It made them believe as though they were in charge, but they were not. So it's reverse psychology, essentially.
Play a football match instead of having a battle. Right? Basically, that's it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just like to say, before we move on to the next hoax indicator, that, and it also links well with what both of you were saying, that the transgender phenomenon has two major effects on the psyche, in my opinion. Of course, it's programmed in, and it exploits gradual trauma that is emerging in those particular psyches. But in regards to the results, it results in two things. First is the idea that the mind is completely separate from the body. Okay, so the idea that you can have the mind of someone else, in this case, for example, a woman, in the body of a man that doesn't match. Okay, this is the first result. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
This is almost similar to Cartesian dualism, is it not? This sort of is born out of this, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I think it will play later on. That's why I'm mentioning it. It will play later on with AI and digital necromancy, right? Because if people believe that you can make an AI model of someone, like what they say, upload the memories in the mind, which is bullshit. But let's take that for what it's being sold as. They will actually believe that the person is there, right? When they talk to the AI model of that person. The other effect is a complete self-loathing, because if the person believes that their mind is trapped, stuck in a body that isn't organically his or hers or whatever pronoun, they will self-loathe automatically. They will never be able to gather their sense of organic worth again, individual worth, right? So these are the two major results, in my opinion, with the transgender agenda, the whole thing.
I would mention, just before we move on into the next topic, I saw recently this fashion designer, and he was exploring the concept of sexiness, and he broke it down into three main types, which was vulgarity, which is exposed, direct, and revealing a lot of the body. Then eroticism, which had an element of mystery, of anonymity, that hides something in specific, that creates that excitement to be revealed. And then he had sensuality, which is when nothing is really exposed, or at least of the body, and nothing is really hinted at, but there is this motion at rest, let's put it that way, that is very, very essential on its own, very essential. It's just moving and it's a feeling. And it seems with people that call themselves transgender, they are very inclined to an identity that is sensual, that it's fluid and moving and can just simply be anything. But often, or so I perceive, in the way they present and dress themselves, it's quite vulgar. Quite vulgar, like exposing their bodies a lot. And so it seems that there is a necessity, a contradictory necessity to their sensual identity, which simply is by feeling, and then they need to expose it with a vulgarity in the way they present themselves. I am not labeling into sensuality and vulgarity as good or bad, but there is certainly a relationship that is contradictory there, I would say.
Yeah, good point.
But you
Absolutely.
are free to go on. Sorry?
I'll go on, but I was going to make just a really quick comment on that, and the types of attractiveness, how people both perceive attractiveness and their preferences for attractiveness within civilizational or cultural contexts, and also how they project themselves or project their attractiveness, right?
Yeah.
And as you said, their sexual attractiveness. It's strange because as society changes and it goes through these various what appear to be formulaic phases, it's almost like it you know it does aesthetically convey itself in those categories, right? So I guess we could say we're in the vulgar phase of that, and as you could say, whereas, for example, perhaps in the early 18th century, Western civilization, take for instance, was more was more sensual, right? It was more of the romantic quality. Um, I think as well, vulgarity has an idea like what you brought up. It's more direct, and I think that itself has it's almost like it's conveying a society that doesn't have any value contained within the mystery. It doesn't want mysteries. It doesn't want something that's mysterious. It finds value in just knowing. And I think that can be probably linked to our need to know, for example, we Google everything, right? Or AI. You go to any university lecture or anything, they're all using AI for everything, and
That's
I'm
true.
not necessarily I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad tool. I'm just saying, there's a certain drive or cultural mindset that has sort of seeped into perhaps the Western mind, perhaps the global mind, which is that they need to know everything is, instantaneously. And there's no delayed gratification or anything like that. There's no
Yes.
view of a symbol as beautiful or anything like that. Is from it's just
Actually, I was talking to Cazumbo the other day about the book as well. And one of the things that emerged was that I told him, that I explained to him that I wanted the book to have the participation of the reader. So I didn't want, or I tried to avoid to the best of my ability, the idea that I was a lecturer, that I know, and I am teaching someone. So I am, someone is receiving a teaching passively as if they know nothing, they can't find out anything by themselves, and I am this, a transmitter of knowledge. That's what I wanted to avoid. I wanted the book to touch upon observations and so on and so forth, but I wanted the participation of the reader as well, because that is actually how knowledge is acquired. I mean, I can tell you something. Cazumbo could explain maths to me from here to eternity. Right? Explain to me, because Cazumbo is very fond of maths and I'm not. He could explain to me all the equations and everything, and I'm not talking about his model that is brilliant, but actual maths, how to resolve this equation. He could explain that to me every day, and I would probably, just passively, yeah, sure, okay, but I wouldn't get it. The only way I would get it is if I find interest in it and actually do the exercises every step, find out for myself, get involved, and etc. You understand? And this is actually what the worldview also promotes, right? It promotes the involvement of the people, in this case, towards a directed fake thing. But that is actually copying the organic way of learning, of actually acquiring that knowledge.
Well, if I may just say something to insert one of my ideas, but not fully expand on it, is that I call this thing the tribute of interest. I don't know if I talk specifically about this with you, Armin, but I call
Mhm.
it that because if we consider ourselves fragmented with disabilities, as in the sense of potential things that we have not yet acquired, then what we need to pay as in currency to obtain them becomes this tribute of interest. And it is in two senses that apparent one, in which you are obviously interested in something, and in the economical one, where you invest and you have a return on the object. Um, and again, this is most influenced by proficiency. For example, Armin is very naturally skilled. Of course, he perfected it over time, but he's very naturally skilled on verbal communication, right? And metaphorical language. He's very good at that. And there is a natural resistance, I would say, to these attributes we are not proficient in. But there is also that element that creates engagement, which is the element of the mystery, which is the essentially what you don't yet understand at fundamentally from its core foundations, but that you can perceive at some direct level. I would just mention that. Yeah, I don't want to expand too long.
No, but it's great points, and yes, you had mentioned that to me in the conversation. Yes, man.
I
And
forgot.
I remember. Yeah, yeah, great point. I don't know if Seth has any questions or if he wants to.
I do have a comment to make, but I'll continue on because I will I will just continue. I will continue replying because I go on tangents, as you can tell. So I'll continue on with this, but
Silas's proficiency is in tangents.
yeah.
No, you're great, man.
So 7 deviations from standard protocol with law enforcement and emergency response personnel. If the event scenes are treated more like a movie set, doubt should be raised. 8. Does the event unfold according to a predictable template? 9. The event triggers a perfectly bifurcated response. This is of most interest here. Again, like the melting pot. So the left and the right can agree it was real, or the black and the white, the cis and the trans, the Muslim and Christian, whatever it may be, Palestine or Zionist, whatever it may be. But each in such a way to allow to scapegoat the other side, like what we're saying, it creates this self-persisting loop, this perpetuating fire. The story is given 10. The story is given disproportionate attention nationally or internationally. 11. The public is goaded into participation in GoFundMe campaigns, hashtags, or activism with the introduction of martyrs and heroes. The martyrs will, of course, be villains to one side of the political spectrum, and the heroes will similarly appear as villains to the opposite side. 12. This is my favourite one. And I'll add another thing into this, as I did with the audiobook. 12. Scooby-Doo justice, or also attached to that is Mickey Mouse logic. The event has a rapid investigation and development, like an episode of a cartoon. The good guys unmask the culprit at the end. I think that's actually, in fact, probably the one of the it's one of those indicators we can prioritize because you find throughout a lot of these stories and events. So, for example, if we look at the event of 2001, right, in New York, Manhattan, you had the Mickey Mouse logic. Well, firstly, you had the Scooby-Doo justice, which is that as soon as it happened, even before it happened, we can imagine, right? This was already prefigured. That Osama bin Laden, who, by the way, 3 months previously, this is the Mickey Mouse logic, had died in the hills of Tora Bora, supposedly, had resurrected himself, exhumed his body from the grave, reanimated himself, and some sort of dark, dastardly necromantic ritual, and had masterminded, the most sophisticated terrorist attack on the Western known, well, really in history, really, from the caves of I think it was Afghanistan, right? So
And he also, and he
yeah,
also managed to discover fireproof paper because the passports were.
I was actually just going to. That's the greatest Mickey Mouse logic of them all. Everything else burned up except, oh my God, look, here's all of these, fire retardant passports. What luck? Yeah, so it's just, I think that is the greatest of all indicators. I mean, you can go into COVID, Armunn, if you wanted, and just if you can lay out some of the major hoax indicators there, man.
Well, the Scooby-Doo justice is because the bat soup video and the idea that this came from Wuhan and that it was basically a sort of super bird flu kind of thing was not only presented immediately, it was even before the actual declaration of pandemic already being promulgated, right? So that the culprit was immediately found. So the culprit is this mystical entity that has superpowers that, for example, can only affect if you're standing up. If you're sitting down, it can't. So it's it has a certain altitude problem. Among other things. But so the culprit was immediately found. And then the Mickey Mouse logic, like I said, these things about standing up or sitting down, or the masks that do this or do that, or because you go to the beach, that's a bad thing, or all of these things. And another thing that links more to the deviations of standard protocol is there were no. I mean, I don't even trust the peer reviews per se, but there was no peer review, there was no evaluation, there was nothing. The measures were implemented immediately under the guise of emergency, and there was no scientific process in any of this, which would be the actual protocol, right? So the actual protocol would be to have a proper method of things. The investigation, it's because it's the same with COVID as it is with any of these shootings. There's no investigation. Have you seen any hint of an autopsy into Charlie Kirk or even the other one, the Arena something? You haven't.
No.
There's also no proper scientific. I'm not talking about scientism, but there's no proper scientific investigation into the CV thing, right? So these are all Mickey Mouse logics, deviations from protocol. The Scooby-Doo justices, because we all knew immediately who the culprit was, right? And then, of course, you create these bifurcated things of it was a lab escape, it was bioengineered, it was the whatever, So you create these scenarios, and none of them add up. This is all part of like a fictional comic book, which is how the hoaxes are performed. They are performed in a fictional universe.
And
It's like the setting is appears to be 21st century Earth, but it's an alternate universe. You know, it's like you entered the Twilight Zone or something. You know?
It's I was just gonna sorry for laughing. It's hilarious just thinking back on the absolute insanity of it all.
Yeah.
You know, you sit down and it's vertically challenged. It was a vertically challenged virus.
I like to call it an altitude problem. The virus had an altitude problem.
Exactly. It just couldn't come down. You know, it couldn't come down. It was high as a kite. But you know, in the case of instead of Scooby Doo justice with COVID with the bat soup, I guess it's Batman justice. You know, where we were living in a hyper reality of Gotham.
Yeah,
Where
yes,
Fauci was, you know, what's his name, Inspector Gordon. You know, even
Mhm.
Fauci mentioned it as well, that I am the science, basically. I am a representative of science, as though science is this, you know, singular
Religion.
monolithic religion or deity, right? And it's something that struck me. I couldn't believe it, you know, at the time, because we all, again, when I was growing up, even when I was an atheist, I understood pretty early on that science was scientism. And you brought up this point as well in your book. And I mean, that was obvious to me. You had the experts presented themselves in white lab coats. I mean, they looked very similar, funnily enough, to the ancient Zoroastrian priests. The Zoroastrian priests would also wear masks, by the way, funnily enough. So the, I could see the religious garb, right? And the religious garb was obviously to evoke a sense of authority in them, right, or to legitimate their imagined authority and status in society. And do you know, funnily enough, going to university, I have lost. I'm going to be honest. I have lost all. Um, I've lost all sense of value in academic experts. I actually place no value on it. Don't get me wrong.
At last.
But that's really, it's cemented it for me, you know. It's yeah, I think the whole thing's a total fiction. But the with COVID as well, and I want Kazumbo and you as well, Armin, to comment on this. Why was COVID so successful where the other ones, such as H1N1, we had that 10 years prior, and then we had in I think it was 1976, we had another H1N1. Why was that not as successful as COVID was, or even polio? These,
Authority.
yeah,
Authority. It had the baton, let's say. It had the judge. It had the policeman. The other ones didn't. You know, people don't organically. Organically, man is not hypochondriac or whatever the name is spelled in English. Hypochondriac, is that?
yeah, hypochondriac,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. Man is not naturally that. Man is not usually organically afraid of catching a disease or whatever, right? So that doesn't play as well. The only difference between this event and the others was that the others were preparations. They were just programming the idea that it may one day be a very serious thing. We must be prepared. And you know, one of the things that immediately emerged is, oh, no, the nations were unprepared, and we have been warning for so long that this could happen, right? The others were mere stage preparations. But if in a previous moment they had applied the baton, when I say that is the authority, like the police, the judge, the legality, the so on, it would have had the same effect. You know, of course, this was far more effective because of all the programming, but the difference was force. Let's say the power of force, in my opinion.
Well, I would say you could base it with the induction theorem, right? Where if you prove it is true for in one instance, or at least in two instances, and it is true in all of them, right? And especially with COVID, I am not even talking about the casualties or the victims or whatever you may want to call it. Rest in peace to whoever died as a result. But I say the fall of the dominoes not in the deaths, but in the reactions that all the nations had. It was also fast, if everybody remembers, right? And that naturally, because if it happens in one side of the globe, then fine, right? But if it happens in a causal chain that is spreading across all corners of our reality, then it suddenly there's an urgency, let's put it that way, to react accordingly before any investigation can be set, as Armunn was saying. It's just that urgent and that imminent. So there was definitely that induction there that didn't allow for any interval of, let's say, preparation or skepticism.
Yeah, I agree, and that is common to all hoaxes that want to direct society towards something. There's always an emergency. There's always there's no time to follow proper procedure, so we have to react now. Like it was with 9/11, like it was with all the shootings and the this and the that. There's always like this sense of we have to do something now, and the more we, the worse it will be, and so on. Yeah.
One interesting part, and you guys can comment about this because I always thought it was. I understand the point, but also it's so eerie that while it was happening, anytime you turned on the news, they were counting the deaths in real time, right? And so it's literally just increasing the fear and panic as well in real time to anybody who is watching. And of course, you want transparency in any urgent situation. But if you really was so fast that you could not react, then it's also unnatural that you would show the count in real time if you were that unprepared, you know? I don't know, that part was what, alongside all the absurd reactions, of people, but that part was the one that got me the most, just that real-time count of deaths.
Well, it's a great point, and essentially it's the idea that wherever power feels that it must not be questioned, it has to invent a theater that surrounds the thing. So it's exactly what we were mentioning. They were creating a tangibility. They were literally creating a reality with it. They were almost reinforcing the lie, right? They knew and intrinsically, implicitly, that what they were stating was a lie, but they had to constantly reinforce that. And it's like what you were saying, Armunn, as well, and I've repeated as well. It's the idea that the truth is at the nucleus of the lie. So essentially, all they have to do is well, firstly, with COVID, though the masquerade was the protection of life. In fact, what they were seeking to do was induce death, not just physical death, but actual psychological death in the population as well, right? So there's an inversion there. This is, of course, the hyper reality of it all.
Yeah.
So what they were doing with the constant, real time running of deaths was that they were trying to create the fiction that they were protecting life. They were trying to turn that into reality, they were trying to say, look, we we're slowing the spread here, right? It would have been, look at this, statistically, the deaths would have been here, but look, they're here now, right? But ultimately, what the statistics didn't show is that people were most people were dead inside. You know, most of
Yeah.
the people that think normatively, right, that of course aren't on the fringes, looking at the shadows of their own culture, they were psychologically dead. So, you know, perhaps not physically, they weren't physically dead. And then, of course, the statistics themselves were completely hogwash
Yeah.
anyway. But
Fabrication. Yeah.
um, it the real tangible thing was the psychological death. But yeah, again, they were trying to create a tangibility from the lie. You know, that came through fear. That's what they were trying to propel it vis-a-vis. Um, but it's almost as well like what you brought up in the book, Armunn, that there was no laws that actually there was no martial law, right? So there was no upending of rights. You had several bylaws and things like that in certain jurisdictions, but fundamentally there was no upending of rights, legally speaking. It was only
Yes.
provided the sort of the legal masquerade through the emergency itself. And you brought up as well, Cazumbo, it was almost a blitzkrieg tactic. It was shock and awe. It was the rapidity of the tyrannical and draconian measures, which made it appear as though it was a done deal, a self-fulfilling prophecy. By the way, similarly to the eschatologies of the Abrahamic religions, they also appear to work in a similar way, at least in the fundamentalist sects. So Israel, for example, is one instance of that. You know, with Zionism, I mean, that's an eschatological self-fulfilling prophecy. But yeah, COVID was similar. Another thing I want to ask, in regards to the school shootings that we saw throughout early, you know, really beginning with Columbine in the late 90s, and really it stretched all the way, well, pretty much to the present day. But it was it really ramped up in, you know, the early 2010s, mid
Yeah.
2010s. Those, of course, I mean, a lot of those were completely fabricated, but um, what do you think what were they vilifying? What was the perpetrator? Was it just the average teenager? Is that what they were
No.
perpetrating? For
No, there
normalcy?
were
Jump in.
there were several ramifications. Some shooters were presented as clear leftists. Some shooters, better said, it started with the shooters being rightist, right? And so it promotes the debate about gun control, etc., etc., right? Then it brought also to the fore the idea that these people were taking drugs, psych meds. I don't know the exact term. Perhaps you guys can help me. But
Psychogenics.
the psychogenics that would affect, you know, the behavior and could cause, etc. So there were several points that they were touching upon, but it was to generate a bifurcation, because for a long time the shooters were presented as right wing, and the right wing would say, no, these are the drugs that is doing this, right? The leftists were saying, no, these are the guns. We need to control the guns. Right? Then leftist shooters emerged, and all of a sudden the right is saying, yeah, yeah. You see the leftist culture of these transgenders and these, you know, all of this brainwash causes shooters, right? So before, when it was a right wing, it was the drugs. Now it was the culture, the leftist culture. And when it was the leftist, from the point of view of the leftist, no, it was systemic racism or systemic whatever that caused that person to go crazy and in a act of desperation shoot. So it was bringing subjects to, because none of them successfully implemented with one thing that one day will be a fact, in my opinion, which is the actual gun control law, right? Similar to what you have in Britain and we have here in Portugal, which is basically guns are, except for hunting, certain types of guns that they are very hard to obtain.
Oh, we can't
None of
even
them.
have blowpipes here.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
So,
very much.
but so it didn't yet finalize with that, but it brought over the span of these events subjects to the public view that I think were pre-programming these bifurcations, that spread them further and further into a sort of horseshoe, right? Because they're basically a mirror of each other. This fantasy left and this fantasy right, they are a mirror of each other, and they can't perceive that they are actually the same at their core. But it brought several subjects to the table that were pre-programming for something that eventually, I think, will be a major psyop. I think that this Charlie Kirk thing was already part of that major thing, because I think it really hit. It had an impact on American society that none of the others previously had, to that extent. And of course, Charlie Kirk represents to the right what George Floyd represents to the left. Of course, George Floyd was that, I don't know if you remember that, black man that was killed by the police,
Yeah.
supposedly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With the Ordo Ab Chao tattoo on his chest.
Right. So,
Yeah.
these are these events do not necessarily need to implement laws immediately, but they implement an agenda. And in these cases, the agenda was to bring subjects, topics to the mind so that they would be programmed there for future triggering, in my opinion.
All in all, there appears to be what I can only call as a customization of death in all these examples. Customization, one, as made to order, which is the meaning of custom, and then as a full word as to made to order in accordance to the user or the buyer's needs, right? So there is this purpose to death in all these examples. But what is very interesting is that Silas was mentioning that people were also psychological dead inside, which was the main purpose. But what is very interesting is that what happened, therefore, were two types of death, the literal and physical one, and then the psychological one, which is most specifically of indifference, because as we began to be more exposed to the death count, right, that was being expressed on the news, this overexposure led naturally to a state of indifference where people started to naturally not care anymore about the threat. And so that itself makes the idea or the enemy fade away, right? Even if it is prevalent as people are presenting it, the psychological self is so tired from this overexposure to which it cannot do nothing but a few set of countermeasures. It becomes indifferent to it. Aside from a few people that obviously are too obsessed with the threat, but there is this natural decline to the threat itself. You know, it's almost like you create a habit of death in the society, which is it's insane to even think of it, but that's what it seems that it happens. Be it with the COVID, be it with the police shootings on black people, be it with the school shootings that you were referring. all of this seems to create a sort of indifference to the idea.
Exactly. Yep. It also dehumanizes the other side. I mean, honestly, I rarely go on Twitter nowadays, but it's I'll go on if there's one of these events, right? Just to see what the hell's going on. But apart from that, right after you basically shut it off, because fundamentally what you're seeing on Twitter, and I mean it just jumps out, it leaps from the screen. When I see it, is you see the dehumanization in both sides. So for example, something recent that came up is that, oh yeah, it's that Tyler Oliveira, right? So he's he went over there and they've got a certain festival in India, right? It's not actually India, it's just this one village in India. And of course, we won't go into it, but Ireland, there's a village in Ireland that has a similar festival, right? Anyway.
I think that's bullshit.
Yeah. It may be. It's
You
it's a
just called it.
it's a scatological occurrence, at both ends
No,
of
you
the
better
world.
explain to
No.
Kazumbo. I don't think he's familiar with what you're
Right.
talking about.
So
And so he couldn't get the joke.
right,
No,
there's
not at all.
to cut a long story short and to be polite about it, Tyler Oliveira, who is an American content creator, he went over to India, and it's a day before Diwali, which is of course the Hindu festival of lights. It's essentially like the Hindu equivalent of Christmas, the biggest event of the year for them.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's this village. It's either a day or a day after or a day before. They have this event where they basically collect all of the cow manure and put it into the middle of the village, right? And they all basically fight, wrestle, and fling the cow dung everywhere, right? So of course Ireland has a similar. It's not necessarily similar to that. They've got was it a sheep? Oh, it's a dung flinging festival, but dung spitting festival, right? Of course. So every culture has a certain weird, a weird tradition like this. Let's just say, right? Anyway, he's pissed off all of India in response to this, and so you've got
I
the
mean,
Indians.
it's obviously bullshit, like I said.
It's yes. And it's so you've got the Westerners, right, that have turned into chauvinists, and then you've got the Indians that are hyper nationalist chauvinists, and you've got again, it's similar to like what you brought up, Armunn, right, with the right and the left when it comes to school shootings. You had the left when the whole transgender school shootings that were going on, particularly in Catholic schools. They were not they weren't necessarily outrightly defending the actions of the transgender shooter in the narrative, but they weren't decrying or deriding the
Well,
transgender shooter as a villain,
no,
right?
Silas, but let me just interject
Yeah,
there. But they defended and celebrated when it was that guy Luigi
exactly.
that killed the CEO, supposedly.
Yes.
So in that event, they actually said, no, I support him. I'm with him.
Yeah.
We should do this more often, right? So it plays into the desensitization that Kazumba was mentioning. But it
Exactly.
goes even beyond desensitization. It becomes, it's an actual enemy that they perceive is being shut down, right? That they perceive that one less enemy in the world.
Bingo. Well, it
It's
creates moral
crazy.
relativism.
It's
Moral
absolutely
relativism.
crazy.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And as well, this also changes the internal moral and ethical landscape of the individual as well, but again of the wider society, like as Kazumbo mentioned quite rightly. And I mean, you've got instances of this all over Twitter. It's constantly occurring, constantly. I mean, for example, let's go back to COVID, the bat soup idea.
Oh.
I don't know how it is in across the world, right? But here, there's a very perfidious and I guess you could say undying myth that the meat that's used in Chinese takeaways is from cats or dogs or something like that, right? And there's this belief, I guess in the Western mindset, it's probably in other places it's prevalent as well, that the Chinese will just eat anything, right? And so this itself was used to inform the bat soup idea, or the bat soup excuse.
Yes.
So it's so weird when you start looking at this. It's like so utterly inverted, right? You've got a society, for example, in the West, which claims to be multicultural, that claims to be egalitarian, that claims to be secular, but everything that it was doing throughout COVID for 2 years, in some cases 3, it was firstly religious, highly religious. I mean, zealous. And then it was built on racism. It was built on racism. I mean, let's just call it what it is, right? This preconceived notion of the food etiquette and the food habits of Chinese people, and so it perpetuated this. It perpetuated it, and it shows the moral and cultural flexibility of the civilization itself. That it's similar to a liar, right? A liar will just flip-flop whatever works in the moment, I don't know if anyone has anything to mention regarding that.
Yeah, well, a good liar will know when to lie and when not to, and will know how to use truth subverted to become a lie, right? And so it is the use of the culinary etiquette that you were talking about. Of course, they eat things that in the West normally we won't, right? But even in Portugal, we eat snails, right? Which is probably something alien to you, right? And it's basically picking up something that is different. And of course, the culture was also inserted by blueprint somewhere in the past. So, and the language as well, as you know, is my contention. But they pick up something that is different and can be shown, like in the public square. Oh, look, different, therefore bizarre, therefore grotesque, therefore brings disease. You see, it's basically this, right? And even when you can't find the proper thing that is different, you invent one that is believable enough to pass on as true, like the bat soup. I mean, no, they don't normally usually eat bats in China, even. So there are some countries that is a dish, but actually it's not in China, not a regular thing in China.
Yeah, I think it's that attribution of guilt through the illogical and the difference. And I say attribution because that word in itself already contains the idea of tribalism, right? And that's precisely what happens. And again, one of the hoax indicators was that the Scooby-Doo justice and the Mickey Mouse logic. But I think, and that in itself, I would say, is precisely because, what is illogical and comic or comical just sticks, right? It's like Silas was saying, the meme that just sticks and people go with it. Because if you give me a full explanation regarding what created the specific disease, people will tend to not follow that. They'll just want a title, right? So you give them any title, And as long as it sticks by not logic, but absurdity, people following that, and I think it's that attribution that happens, I would say.
That is a superb point. So essentially, it's if you create a lie as well that's too complex, the complexity itself opens it up to critique. And
Yeah.
of course, a lie that's too complex and that is not simplistic or simple, and it's relaying to the target, they who you wish to deceive. They again, they may trip you up in your logic, right?
Mhm.
So, well, here's another one, right? So we were learning, quote, learning, or being taught about sustainability. Funnily enough, sustainability was linked with, God, what's the automation, right? Basically getting rid of humans from the labor force. That itself has Scooby-Doo logic and Mickey Mouse, Scooby-Doo justice and Mickey Mouse logic in it, right? So effectively, is the Club of Rome mentioned in the early 70s, in the Limits to Growth report, we must ensure that the human being sees themselves as the enemy to Mother Gaia or mankind. And so, again, you have the religiosity of it all, right? And do you know the first thing the professor asked us all before he, and of course, this is a rhetorical question because if you answer this incorrectly, you're called the climate denier. But the first thing he asked was, is there anyone in here that does not believe that the climate is driven by human activity? And of
I
course, I
would
want
raise
to,
my hand. I would raise
well,
my hand.
I wanted to, of course, if I raise my hand and say, no, it's no, you silly cunt, it's the big ball of fire in the sky, of course, wouldn't go down too well. But it's weird. It's interesting watching the psychological um, patterns of people. So, for example, when they brought up automation, so we went through sustainability. So, of course, we're the problem. That's essentially what you can extract. That's the primary social messaging. But then you get to automation, and then the idea that you see, it's all again. It didn't even need it to be. It didn't need to be prompted by the lecturer or his material that he was conveying to us. People were already saying, yeah, automation is great. That this is, discussion amongst the student body. Automation is great because it gets rid of human error, right? And
Mhm.
so there's this idea that, well, firstly, the error is a problem, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you as a human being, you need to make mistakes so you can learn. If you don't make mistakes, you'll never learn, right? And we learn through doing and through trial and error. And so there's a fundamental problem with that, right? But it's this idea as well that human beings are themselves an error. Just by that term alone, that is a magic term, has magical connotations. Human error. And then you have, so all of that, is there any comments you could make upon this with I guess, the hoax indicator and just even the idea of it being, I guess, a form of a psyop and psy war?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would comment that automation is, made with machines or AI or whatever that is built by man. So if there is an error in automation, it's also a human error, right? So you can't resolve anything that way. You just, make the error more frequent and quicker if there is an error in the beginning. But yes, the idea is always, and that is one of the key points that traverses the entire book, is that there is this need for a sort of feeling of inferiority, feeling of detachment with nature and the organic life, which also plays, like I said in the very beginning of the conversation, with wordplay, with language, and the way we use words. So, of course, human error is a term that has a programming effect, like you've just stated, like many others do. But the intent, really, at the deepest, is the mental character must feel, okay, I either follow this surrogate external ego, or I am abandoned and alone and I will die. Okay, because it lost contact with its own individuality and with the faith, which could also be translated as trust if people don't like the word because it's too linking to religion, with the faith or trust in that individuality, in that guide, inner guide, that eventually finds a way to resolve whatever comes your way, whatever happens. Of course, you're not supposed to be an island, so you interact with others. You do have a group that you would call a family or that you would call a tribe, whatever you prefer. You interact with those and you solve those problems together, but by all of these being individuals. And what happens is that these worldviews, of course, downgrade the psyche into an abandoned mind character. And it does that by mimicking the actual psyche itself. So they provide an external ego. They even provide a semblance of an external essence, you know, which in this case is an external God, right? So, for example, if you would have uh, um, like I say, the just metaphorically, if the Pope is the ego, the external ego, right, in the Catholic religious setting, then the external God that the Pope refers to is the external essence. It's a copy of what happens inside. You see, because, like you well stated, and I've put also in the book, that quote from Deja Woodard that is also in your server, Silas. The poison contains the cure, because when you realize that the poison is a mimic of the health, of the actual health, how the health should be, then you start to understand, hang on, um, this works because I already have it in me. I've been fooled with my own uh, um, grandeur, if you like, with my own shine. It's like, you're imagine that you're a being of light, and I'm talking metaphorically now, not religious or mystically. Imagine that you're a being of light, and someone comes to your door and sells you a lamp. That is basically what happened, right? And you bought the lamp, you were convinced to buy the lamp. You buy the lamp, you walk with the lamp everywhere, and you don't understand that the actual light that illuminates where you go is yours, not the lamp.
Yeah. Well, the lamp as well is a simulacra of the sun. It's like what you're
Right.
stating in your metaphor.
Oh.
Yeah, it's no, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I agree. One thing I would add as well is that so well, actually there's several things, and well, actually no, this is gonna this will take us on a tangent. So you just jump in, Cazumbo. Do you have any comments you want to add?
Oh,
No,
yeah, Armunn?
no, I was going to
Funny,
say,
man.
do take us on a tangent, man, because we eventually have to call it a night, no?
Oh my God, yeah, 4 hours. Jesus, right. Okay, Cazumbo, please, right.
I'll be
Yeah.
very brief. I was just going to say that what Armin was essentially saying is technology as an extension of our human ability, or as a replacement of human disability, right? And what we have in our modern time, especially with artificial intelligence, is already presently that futuristic view of a technological world where the human body has fused mechanically um, with with technology, right? There is to some degree ma many cyborgs currently operating within humanity, as Armunn
True.
said metaphorically, having being of light yet carrying a lamp. Um, and it's very interesting that these technological devices can span from, I don't know, social media to, it doesn't have to be as extreme as artificial intelligence, which is the most recent example. But you know, it is something as common as television, right? Which is something that people wouldn't think of as a disability. But
Yeah.
you know, it is using perception for you. Let's put it that way. But I will not expand too much.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it is. It is directing perception because, in fact, a worldview, a false worldview that is imposed over the organic, is entirely made up of perception, nothing more.
Yeah.
You can reinforce perception with props, which can be buildings, which can be symbols, which can be language, which can be, clothes or garments, whatever. You can reinforce with props, but the actual fact is that the worldview itself is made entirely 100% on perception. If the perception goes, you stop seeing that world. That world doesn't exist for you anymore. You know, you can see it as you're visiting a Disneyland, right? You know that is not real. That it doesn't actually exist organically. There are no Mickey Mouses and Donald Ducks living there. But you can visit. Yeah, I'm visiting. It's like a theme park. That's
Yeah.
basically it. Yeah.
Do not.
There's another thing. Oh, sorry, Kazumbo, please.
Now, I was just going to quote, "Do not try and bend the spoon." That quote by Matrix. So go on.
There is no
Well,
spoon.
yeah, there is no spin. Yeah, yeah. Well, also it's the so another thing I just want to quickly mention, and it ties in with the I guess the demonological view of all of these various control mechanisms. We got to the point of the lecture in sustainability where he was talking about embodied carbon. He was like, "Yeah, when we cut down the trees, the carbon is released." And I was thinking, I was just, I was having flashbacks of The Exorcist. I was like, yeah, it's like exorcise the demon. The demons are released from their vessels. It's like some sort of a Dybbuk box or something. And
Yeah.
it's so weird when you see these secular religions in action. And yeah, I mean, it really is. There's a formula to it all. Another thing to just quickly mention before I let you guys all go. Sorry, I'm totally lost in this conversation.
It's a good
Another,
sign.
it is a good sign, yeah, is that you have the reason you want to make it simplistic and even stupid, right? So, for example, we were talking about, the fire retardant passports. It's because there almost is a guilt through the illogical, right? So you create the illogical, the stupid, the dumb, and you get the, for example, educated experts or the educated middle class or professionals to believe in that. And like Mark Twain stated, it's easier to fool people than it is to convince them they've been fooled, right? Because again, the perception is they're tied to it through this guilt vis-a-vis the illogical. They don't want to admit that they were stupid, right? So there's a complicity in it, and this is of course how multi-level marketing schemes work. It's how Ponzi schemes as well work, which are self-same, and of course cults as well. But yeah, absolutely. Very fascinating discussion, gentlemen.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
And it's a pity that Zeal had to leave. Yeah, Regan was here for a while as well, but just listening. That Zeal had to leave, but his participation was also excellent. So, will you be posting this up?
I will, but I may have to do it in 2 parts because it's 4 hours. I didn't even notice it. Oh my god, guys! Honestly, could have ran a marathon in this time.
Yeah. There was a time I was hungry, and then the hunger passed. So yeah, that's how long it was.
Well, there you go. Well, this is the great deep discussion for it's like a dietary plan. There you go.
Yeah.
How to lose weight. Listen to Armunn and Silas with Cazumbo. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh man.
All right. So, everyone, thank you very much for this brilliant discussion. Thank you, Silas, again for doing the audiobook version of the book. Thank you, Cazumbo, for actually motivating me to do it and helping me out also during the process. And thank you all for being here, for being great and discussing, deeply these subjects that I know are not for everyone. Thank you from the heart. Thank you.
Been a joy, man.